The boy was filling bottles with water using magic, carefully counting each one. When he touched the last one, he noticed it was the 1,000th. He sighed with relief, closed his eyes, and quietly whispered to himself that all tasks for today were completed and the celebration could be considered over. He looked at the clock, smiled, and said that it was wonderful. It was only morning, and he had already accomplished a lot, so the rest of the day promised to be extremely productive. Everything went much faster than he initially thought. The young man pondered. Distilled water is the main component of any porcelain processing procedure. It is also needed for preparing living organisms because its quality determines the result of the entire production. The distilled water he created was exceptionally pure, a special product of the highest grade. Evenly saturated with magical power, it became unique and invaluable for any complex alchemical or manufacturing process. The boy closed the clock and said that now he could devote the afternoon to studying materials. Suddenly, a man ran into the room and, barely catching his breath, loudly greeted Master Russ. The young man sharply turned around. A stranger stood before him. Russ recognized in him Master Lee Hales and immediately asked how he could help and why he had appeared here. It turned out that Lagelsum was an alchemist from the smithing department. He twisted a strange, bitter smile and replied that he himself did not know what to say. It was because of people like him, he said, that the fundamental research department often came under attack. But suddenly he cut off the conversation and added that it did not matter. The head of the association wanted to see Russ immediately. He raised his eyebrows in surprise and wondered what could have happened, while Lagelsum quickly walked out. The boy involuntarily thought that Lee Hales had always somehow been connected with him, and this sudden meeting clearly concealed something more than a mere coincidence. Russ began to reason that he had always been responsible for the budget of the fundamental research department, while Lee Hales worked in the smithing department, which forged armor and was considered the most profitable. The young man, with trembling in his heart, tried to understand the reason for Lagelsum's good mood, because he usually was distinguished neither by sincerity nor kindness. Meanwhile, the man grabbed a box with water, decisively declared that he was going to buy distilled water, and sharply shouted at the maids to mind their own business and not interfere with his intentions without necessity. Russ, feeling uneasy, headed to the office of the association's head, not knowing what to expect when he entered. The head threw him a sheet of paper and dryly informed him that the budget of the fundamental research department had been cut. The young man flipped through the papers with surprise and shock, couldn't hold back, and exclaimed, "This can't be," since the department was effectively left without funding, as if its existence had simply been erased. Russ bitterly recalled that their department always helped others, who had achieved almost nothing on their own, and the head just waved him off, saying that the budget is now divided among the most profitable departments. The youth responded passionately that this was exactly the point their department could make a breakthrough. However, the head interrupted him and irritably thundered that enough arguing. The fundamental research department is being disbanded, and all its members must join others. And finally, he coldly added that Russ was still lucky he was not being fired, and he should be grateful for such mercy, and when everything becomes clear, he could again attend his usual activities. Russ thought angrily that arguing was pointless, since without their department, they wouldn't even be able to make tubes for complex devices. He grabbed the papers, sharply turned around, and rushed away. The young man recalled that all their achievements were only possible thanks to the joint work of their department and the formula development department. They were always the ones providing all the solutions and substrates needed for production. He sighed heavily, thinking that only the superstitions of the association's head and the misunderstanding of others created the false impression that fundamental research had achieved nothing, although in reality it was the opposite. Russ returned to his office and heavily sank into a chair. Looking up at the ceiling, he thought about how their numbers had dwindled since the current leader took the position of head, yet he still managed to keep the team afloat. He was convinced, without their fundamental science department, no development would have had a chance. They laid the solid foundation on which all others were built. Each of these developments required the purest and highest quality materials, and Russ, with fatigue in his voice, thought that he had already prepared everything necessary, although now it seemed needed by no one. With bitterness, he realized that the budget cuts and weakening of the fundamental research department had rendered it powerless, and now he was convinced that he would not be able to defend his position before the current head. Suddenly, a sound came from the communication equipment. The boy asked cautiously who the message was from and looked at the typewriter, which began to print lines of a new letter by itself. Before him stood a model of the perfection of modern metalworking. Russ smiled bitterly, thinking that their department had created all the main materials for this as well. He carefully took the letter in his hands. He was glad to learn that the letter was from Kareen. The graduation ceremony was already being prepared at school. They had always been like comrades and strangely felt the same wave. The girl wrote that it was wonderful and had a proposal for him. He recalled how in childhood they had turned the classroom into a real thicket and had to write many apologies for their pranks. Russ remembered with a sad smile that it was not a very wise prank, and also thought that Kareen had participated in the border war. The boy loudly asked what had happened, and Kareen wrote that he would probably consider her words harsh, but she decided to be frank and say everything without hiding. In the letter, Russ read that Kareen had been granted a fief on the border, and she asked him to help develop these lands. Then he felt two paths were opening before him. It was time to choose which one to take. He pondered. The first path would mean spending the rest of his life in endless household chores, and the second, like a clean parchment on which any future could be drawn, filled with unexpected opportunities. Russ looked out the window and wondered if he should go. In his thoughts, he saw himself spending joyful days again with Kareen, and this hope warmed his heart. He thought if the previous president had remained at the head of the association, everything would have been wonderful. He sincerely respected that man and even felt warm feelings toward him. He especially remembered the former president, O'Galgamer, a man who knew the value of fundamental research and taught it to others. Russ ran his hand over the books and recalled how they had created many recipes together. Luzuto and other members of the Fundamental Research Department were the true heart and soul of the association, that strong core without which this magnificent structure would have long since fallen apart. The boy took his backpack and left the office, thinking that after the political changes, Mr. Hariyamu had been transferred to another service, and instead, a former official had become the head of the cooperative. Stopping in front of the chairman's office, he listened and heard voices. Inside, Lee Halesome was lively discussing something with the leader. Russ was about to knock, but stopped and decided to eavesdrop. A little documents were placed on the table, and Lee said that these were all the data about the master blacksmith. The chairman confirmed that it was true and stated that all funds would go to the Armor Development Department. Lagelsum, shining with joy, thanked him and exclaimed that he knew how to create a new employment agency, and the chairman ordered him to work on samples from the arsenal. Russ thought angrily that they could at least speak a little quieter, because their plans were leaking out too clearly. The young man decisively knocked on the door, entered without waiting for permission, and the chairman immediately became angry, shouting that he was forbidden to enter so rudely. Russ placed a resignation letter on the table and, looking the chairman straight in the eyes, confidently said that he was leaving. The chairman, stunned, asked what he had just said. Russ did not listen and headed for the exit. Lagelsum loudly protested why he wanted to leave on his own, and the chairman shouted that Russ had no right to leave. The young man stopped and handed over the documents. Calmly, without any emotion, he said that he had the right to resign whenever he wanted. The chairman and Halesome leaned over the papers, and suddenly their faces changed. Fear appeared on them. Russ explained. His employment contract concerned only the Fundamental Research Department, and this department had already been disbanded due to someone's decision so. Therefore, he could leave the association that very day. Russ waved goodbye to them and turned around, ready to go. But Lagelsum shouted in anger, who would now do the household chores and prepare distilled water for him. The boy looked at him coldly and said that he had to brew it himself. It was not part of the contract at all, and he himself was a necromancer, and the whole process was extremely simple. The chairman just shrugged strangely and said that it was time for him to go. Lagelsum tried to pretend indifference, saying he could manage on his own. The chairman looked at him intently and asked if it was true, and he uncertainly confirmed. The chairman of the association said sternly that he did not need people who could not even understand how sincerely the association wanted to leave them at least as simple assistants, and barked, "Russ, get out." Russ calmly replied that he did not need his kindness. He said dryly, "See you," and loudly slammed the door as he left the office, the corridor filled with his footsteps. Suddenly he stopped in front of the painting. On it, a majestic dragon stretched its head toward a man, and that man, mysterious and strong, stretched out his hands in response. Russ thought with bitter sadness that he was seeing this painting for the last time. He quietly thanked for the support, turned around, and left through the door, leaving the association behind. Having left the city limits, he suddenly burst out with a joyful exclamation, finally free. His mood was uplifted, and he had just torn up the lease agreement for his apartment. The boy pulled out a scroll and whispered to himself, "Isn't it time to move on to Karen?" Loudly shouting the spell, unfolding, manifestation, behemoth, he touched the scroll, and it shone with magical light. A gigantic behemoth constable grew before him. Russ smiled, nimbly climbed onto its back, and loudly ordered to move forward. The powerful beast dashed toward the border, raising clouds of dust behind it. Russ thought that the territory of Kali Lung stretched to the northern outskirts of the country, and that was exactly where his path led. He contacted Kali Long and said that from now on he would take care of her. The girl replied that they were waiting for him with open arms. The boy strangely noted that she was exaggerating too much because he was not confident in his own abilities. Russ continued his journey on the back of the behemoth. they entered a dense forest, and the boy quietly whispered that he had not seen these places for a long time, beginning to carefully observe the nature around. He suddenly remembered that he had already been to this paradise place when he was gathering materials. Flowers were blooming everywhere, a light breeze was refreshing, and the incredible aroma of young shoots filled the air with life. Russ said that he had some free time, so he decided to start collecting. He sincerely hoped that near the lake there were still small settlements that had not undergone changes. Behemoth sharply began shaking his head and whipping his tail, then rushed forward. Russ thought with surprise that these were alarm signals, as if something bad, something threatening had happened. Russ ordered Behemoth to be careful and thought that the wooden rattles from the alarm might belong to His Majesty, but suddenly he noticed a girl lying unconscious on the ground in front of him. The boy jumped off Behemoth's back and loudly ordered him to stay alert. He looked around carefully and thought that a traveler on the road might be bait in a trap, but the likelihood of such deception here was minimal. Russ bent down and, with a tremor in his voice, whispered that this girl belonged to a rare species, the night priestesses, beings he had only seen in legends. He sat down beside her and gently touched her body to make sure she was okay. Russ, overwhelmed with doubt, assumed that this was a priestess form from the community of the goddess of vengeance, and when his fingers touched her skin, he felt a strong fever. The boy whispered that she was unconscious. He remembered the fever-reducing herb and wondered if she herself knew that such a herb existed on this path. The young man carefully turned her on her side to free the airways and check her condition, and whispered an apology for having to touch her without permission. When he looked closely at the girl's face, shock pierced him. She was burning with fever, her body was exhausted. Russ thought angrily that this poisoning had constricted her body, and the situation could not be worse. He was obliged to save her. Russ unrolled a scroll, which shone and covered the girl with a magical veil. He urged the scroll to begin the process of creating a healing remedy. The scroll shone even brighter and began, like a scanner, to read information from the girl's body, as if studying her condition from the inside. The boy felt unbearable heat and catastrophic exhaustion of strength. A very difficult time had come for the alchemist. Russ painfully admitted that she had to endure terrible trials. He, carefully rereading the lines displayed by the scroll, finally understood the true cause of the fever that was destroying the girl. Russ said that she had deep wounds on her side, and now everything became clear. This was a special kind of poison known as familiar, and he thought that none of his usual potions would help here. The young man glanced at the plants around and decided that he had to create a completely new healing potion. He rushed to search for the necessary herbs and loudly ordered Behemoth to guard the girl. Russ broke through the thickets of the forest but quickly froze. He was suffocating and could not restore his breathing after running. He wiped the sweat from his forehead and thought with regret. It was in vain that he skipped daily training. Now his body could not withstand even such loads. The boy finally firmly decided, from now on he must take care of himself, otherwise there would be no success. He took the bottle, drank it to the bottom, and finally was able to breathe normally. Before him stretched a small lake framed by grasses. Russ exclaimed with joy this was exactly what he was looking for. He thought that this herb was gradually disappearing because someone regularly came for it. Russ began sorting through the plants, studying their effects. Some enhanced body regeneration, others restored damaged areas, and a few neutralized toxins. Eventually, he chose the last plant. The young man pondered. An ordinary herb by itself is weak, but transformed into a potion, it acquires extraordinary power and completely changes its purpose. He smiled sadly. If he had met this plant earlier, it would have been extremely difficult for him to stop the poison. Russ confidently said that now he could create the necessary potion, looked at the water, and remembered how once his brother ended up in the same condition. The boy decided to start making the medicine. Summoning the scroll again, he began the alchemical preparation process. Russ clearly said, creation, release, gravitational yoke, 5 objects necessary components. Then he added, and now purification, and suddenly a huge drop of water appeared shining and pure. Russ thought that every time he brewed a potion, he had to use Armanax because he did not want to waste time on unnecessary details. But this time he was forced to create everything himself, and it became a real problem. This water was like the very concept itself. It became what it had to become, and Russ felt its essence weaving into his design. There are several tricks to create the perfect substance. Russ felt ready to read 1,000 books every day and brew 1,000 bottles of potion, because now his new training was aimed at creating the purest elixir. The boy smiled and felt that the purest liquid has the greatest power to restore the body. He began to combine the ingredients perfect water merged with healing herbs, and from this something completely new was born. The perfect balance of components was supposed to give a result. The water was to shine with a deep violet, a true symbol of perfect harmony. Russ touched the drop and whispered that this was purification. Now the potion was ready. He thought that this is exactly what the full process of making medicine looks like for that wounded girl who is now lying unconscious. The boy poured the finished potion into a bottle. It would be easier to give it to the girl this way, and smiling with satisfaction, he said that everything worked out, and now it was time to return to her. Russ turned to the girl and looked in surprise at Behemoth, who was heavily stomping on the ground. The animal was jumping and shaking its head as if it really disliked something, although maybe it was just playing. The hippopotamus stomped even harder, its paws drumming, and it jumped wildly. Russ hesitantly thought that it seemed to be deliberately trampling the ground, and for a moment he was confused, not understanding what had happened to it. The boy ran up to the beast. With his heart in his throat, he anxiously asked if everything was all right and what had happened while he was gone. The hippopotamus raised its paw and sharply shook its head, demanding Russ to come closer. The paw print remained on the ground, with a black spot darkening the indentation. Russ said with surprise that it was a familiar spirit. He ordered the hippopotamus to hold it tightly and not let go. The boy touched the strange liquid and immediately noticed. Its appearance was too suspicious. He assumed that perhaps this creature had been watching the girl and had appeared here because of that, so Russ approached her and quietly apologized. He carefully dropped the potion on her, believing that his main task now was to save her life. The last drops fell on her face. The wounds on the girl's body began to disappear. She trembled and gradually regained consciousness. Her lips barely moved. She whispered, "What happened?" And suddenly her eyes opened wide. She suddenly jumped up and recoiled backward, taking a fighting stance. In a cold voice, the girl asked, "Are you my enemy?" Russ was completely confused by such a reaction. He expected thanks and a calm farewell, so he only pointed to the hippopotamus's print and said that if it was about the one who had been chasing her, then he was right there. The girl did not take her eyes off him for a long time, hesitating whether to be distracted. Finally, she dared and turned her head and indeed noticed the creature that was watching her closely. She sharply drew her sword and sternly asked Russ, "Who are you?" At first, the boy answered that he was from the association, but then stopped and corrected himself, saying that was no longer true. He introduced himself as a traveling alchemist who did not even have money and thought confusedly that he almost remembered his past. He still, as if out of habit, introduces himself as a member of the association, although in reality, he is now unemployed and completely unrelated to it. The girl came closer and loudly asked again if he really practiced alchemy. Russ waved his hands and confusedly asked her not to shout so loudly. He sincerely apologized, admitting that he healed her wound without permission, but immediately reassured her the poison had not yet been completely removed from her body, so there was no need to worry. He did nothing else. He handed her a vial of potion. The girl examined it carefully, then bowed and said he had saved her. She was sincerely grateful for the medicine. Russ just smiled in response. She anxiously asked how she could repay him for the help, and resolutely added that she was ready to do anything to repay the saved life. Russ scratched the back of his head, awkwardly thinking that she did not understand him, did not need payment at all, but apparently the girl thinks he deliberately did not complete the treatment and is now waiting for a reward. He said heavily and convincingly that he never had any evil intentions and it is not worth thinking so. She owes him nothing. The boy picked up the potion, pointed at it with his finger, and explained that he only wanted her to be conscious and able to drink it on her own. A smile blossomed on her face, and she said that he should not apologize. On the contrary, she should ask for forgiveness for always being on guard, and again asked what he wanted. Russ blushed from her beauty and smiled awkwardly. Misunderstandings were cleared, and the girl agreed that he truly had good intentions. She looked at the bottle and said that his potion was clearly very high quality and could not be free. Her voice carried a resolute confidence. The boy looked at her with surprise, then smiled broadly, took out a whole bag of medicine, and said that if she really thinks so, they can make a deal. Russ placed his hand on his chest and confidently said that he was a traveling alchemist and served Karin, Lady of the Northern Border, adding that if difficulties ever arose, he would gratefully use the power of her sword. The boy waved his hand and smiled broadly at the girl, then looked intently into her eyes and asked her name, trying to learn at least a little about the one he had just saved. Russ took out a bottle of potion and, smiling, jokingly said that now she owed him. The girl laughed in response, and their gazes met with a light trust. She handed him a sword and said in a raised voice that she was the goddess of vengeance Tora, one of the 3 Night Swords, and he should remember her name well because she was the one who dispels evil. Tora looked deeply into his eyes and added that she did it with her sword. Russ smiled awkwardly, thinking she loved herself too much, and handed her the bottle, saying she could drink it. Tora took the potion and drank it. Her face melted with surprise. She sighed and looked at her hands, then said in amazement that she felt a strange warmth in her body. She touched her cheeks, drew her sword, and looked intently at its reflection to check her guess. The girl could not believe her own eyes. Her face was drowned in tears of joy. she happily exclaimed that the curse was gone, and Russ looked away. He was embarrassed to look at the crying girl. Tora could not hold back tears and, sobbing chokedly, explained that it was a curse that no holy water could remove. Russ guessed the additional effect of his potion had broken the curse. He believed that his potion was absolutely pure water, thus a divine drink, stronger even than holy water. Russ smiled, catching her sincere joy in her gaze. He climbed onto Behemoth and thought that lifting the curse was just a bonus, and he had something else he wanted to give her. Behemoth rushed forward, and Russ shouted to Tora, "Wait just a minute." The girl rushed to stop him, her heart in her throat, but she could do nothing. She shouted anxiously for him to stop, but Russ did not listen because he already knew exactly what to do and where to find what he needed. Tora carefully looked at the bottle and whispered that she had found the legendary elixir in gold. Now she would be forever in great debt to Russ. She lifted the vial and the sunlight played on the glass. Tora smiled and said it was funny, and at the same time amazing how great this man was who saved her from the curse. Her hands were trembling. Russ told her that all this was at the northern border. The girl sharply turned around and left the forest, firmly declaring, "First revenge, then north." They and Tora were moving away from each other, and in those moments it became clear. Love is the very reason for the existence of the world. Only a few people know this truth and can share it with others. Night came. The hippopotamus stopped, and Russ jumped down. He petted the beast and said they would spend the night here. Tonight the stars shone brighter than ever, and it was amazing. Russ made a fire and, warming himself by the campfire, thought that after parting with Tora he decided to head straight north. He gazed at the starry sky and organized his thoughts. The boy quietly whispered that he hadn't had such a night for a long time. In the association he always worked without sleep, conducting research until dawn, and now he sat in the middle of the forest and felt peace. Russ unfolded the map and, leaning over it, said that ahead there was probably another village right before the very northern border, and they had to get there soon. Biting a bar, he noticed how the hippopotamus brazenly tried to steal a piece. Russ smiled and joked that it was not for him. He thought that during this whole journey, he would have to eat such simple food. The bar consisted of various dried grains and fruits, and he had accidentally invented it during old experiments. Karin gave it a strange name. Russ recalled she called this bar the herbal brick. Yes, exactly that. The boy bit off a piece and honestly admitted that it actually tasted pretty good. He raised his head, looked at the starry sky, and decided, by tomorrow evening they must reach the village, and now it was time to sleep. The next day they moved on, but suddenly froze. Russ jumped down, unfolded the map, and looked intently at the area, then said with surprise that they were here for a reason. It turned out this was the village of Tom. The boy entered the settlement, which looked abandoned, and hesitantly said that, judging by everything, this village must be the one Karin mentioned, but it was hard for him to believe that it had become so empty. Russ patted Behemoth and smiled as if to say that since they had already made it here, it was worth looking around. The beast's help was no longer needed, so he sincerely thanked him and began to cast a spell, preparing to return. He rolled up the magical scroll and said that they would meet again and set off on a new journey, but suddenly he was interrupted by a man who unexpectedly asked, "Who are you?" Russ looked at him in surprise and replied that he had noticed him long ago, then added that he was a traveling alchemist named Russ, but the man cut him off and exclaimed in surprise that he had called himself an alchemist. The man asked if Russ wanted to visit their elder and greet him. The young man thought for a moment and then agreed. As they walked through the streets, Russ carefully examined everything around. Abandoned shops, deserted houses, and neglected wells. Everything looked extremely old and forgotten. Russ thought with a heavy heart that the settlement really looked very empty. Many houses had long been uninhabited, and such dwellings were becoming more and more numerous, so the man stopped in front of a large and beautiful house. The young man looked around and saw dried herbs near the entrance. The branches hanging by the door could indicate that this was the elder's house. Life had still been ongoing here recently, but now everything looked muted. The man knocked on the door and loudly shouted to the elder that he had brought an alchemist with him. An elderly man with a cane slowly came out of the house and, looking closely, asked if he was really a true alchemist. The one who brought Russ awkwardly replied that he had not checked yet, but he looked exactly like one. Russ took out a medallion. It had a carved tree and scales, with the moon and sun on the pans. He smiled kindly and introduced himself, Russ, traveling alchemist, and this symbol confirmed his words. The man leaned in, looked closely at the medallion, and, surprised, apologized for his harshness, explaining that he just wanted to be sure. The village elder confidently stated that he represented this community, and indeed such medallions are worn only by true alchemists, and if his memory did not fail him, the insignia on Russ was of the highest rank. Russ looked at the medallion and thought that these badges were not so much symbols of honor as clear confirmation of the alchemist's identity and his rank. At first he waved his hand and did not give it much importance, but eventually admitted before him was a first-rank medallion. The Alchemists Association was divided into classes, but more than half of the members had the highest rank, even those like Lee Halesome. Russ decided that he had nothing to hide. His former association was one of the best in the country. He smiled and confirmed to the elder. Yes, he really was an alchemist of the highest rank. The elder pointed to his house, with a tremor in his voice, apologized for the disrespect of his subordinate, and invited Russ in for tea as he had an important request for the master. Russ thought that probably various services were the reason for the empty houses in the village, but the respect for alchemists of the highest rank indicated that these people were well-mannered, and he thanked the elder for the invitation. They entered the house and settled at the table. The woman who brought the tea apologized. The tea was not of the highest quality. Russ thought the conversation might be difficult, but smiled and thanked her. He brought the cup to his nose and happily inhaled its aroma after long days of eating only dry bars and drinking infusions from ordinary leaves. This warm tea seemed to him a real miracle. The elder did not beat around the bush. He immediately asked if Russ had old magical stones with him. Russ asked in surprise if he really needed the old stones, put the cup on the table, and added that his answer would depend on the details of the request, asking to explain the reason. The man smiled and said that Russ had probably heard about the magical weapon reform that was adopted last year. Russ confirmed that he remembered something. He recalled Lee Halesome from the smithing department, who boasted all week that this weapon was his creation and laughed at everyone around. He never tired of saying that the new weapon would raise his authority, but the man who brought Russ angrily added that this reform was just a change of name. Instead of a powerful weapon, only sticks that were worthless remained. The elder sternly reminded Zara to keep himself in check, but agreed his words were not without reason. Then he asked Zara to bring examples. He nodded. Russ meanwhile asked for a more detailed explanation. 2 pistols were placed on the table, which externally were almost indistinguishable. The elder pointed to the simpler one and said that it was the old model, and the decorated one was already the new sample. The elder explained that for those who lacked deep knowledge, magical weapons had always been an important tool. It was so before, but after the reform everything changed. He noted that the old model was reliable and very economical. The charged stones were rarely replaced, so this weapon was the perfect friend for those who lived on the border. The H-32 model, created a few years ago, became especially famous. It was nicknamed the Immortal, and many trusted it with their very lives. Russ clenched the weapon in his hands and seemed to sink into memories. At the beginning of his service in the association, he was working on this model. The then head of the blacksmith department was Master Galgamer, and together they created this weapon that allowed a soldier to die only of old age. Experts then called that model unremarkable junk, but Russ only smiled. For ordinary users, it was a real treasure. He said he expected nothing less from Master Galgamer. The boy contemptuously added that compared to this weapon, the latest model R001 looked simply pathetic. Zara interrupted him and angrily exclaimed that it was nonsense, but the elder sharply made him be silent. The old man looked seriously at Russ and quietly said that his words were accurate. The power had increased a little, but this weapon broke down after just a dozen shots. The elder continued, explaining that it had become even worse. Now it required fuel, and the R001 model was charged only with the latest magical stones, which cost huge money and ran out quickly. Zara added that the old model actually had enough power, and this made the elder sigh. He agreed, but added with bitter sadness that the production of those samples and stones for them had long been discontinued. The elder sadly explained that the old magical weapon still works, but without the stones it seems empty and useless, and Zara added that they had no choice. They had to buy new rifles, which were also useless and consumed a lot of money. He continued that because of this, the peasants were forced to save and turn a blind eye even to the damage caused by monsters, and sometimes the new weapons simply exploded or broke in battle. Zara angrily added that because of this, the damage from beasts and monsters increased many times, and people began to feel defenseless. The elder sighed sadly and said that people began to be afraid, especially those who feed their families. Russ interrupted him and clarified that in the end they were forced to flee to quieter lands. Finally, he understood why those old stones were needed. The elder asked hopefully if that meant he would give them, and Russ scratched his head confusedly and explained that no, he simply did not have them, and disappointment appeared on the faces of the elder and Zara. Russ suddenly smiled and declared that he would create them himself. The elder and Zara looked at him stunned. The old man exclaimed that it was wonderful, and Zara, overwhelmed with emotions, shouted that it was simply incredible, and Russ was surprised by their enthusiasm. He immediately clarified. Their joy was premature. His work would not be free. They both, frightened, assured that they understood this well. Russ explained that he needed access to the resources of their forest, of course, within reasonable limits, and asked how they felt about this. The elder and Zara exchanged surprised glances. Zara clarified if that was really all he demanded. Many trees of the Cagely genus grow in their forest, but he did not understand at all how they could be useful. Russ replied with a slight smile. Wonderful Cagely really grow in abundance. He thought that such naivety was quite natural for people far from alchemy, and recently even settlers found it harder to grow these trees in their villages. Suddenly he recalled lines from ancient records. In every settlement there must be at least one Cagely tree, because it is the very foundation of harmony and prosperity. They went outside and residents approached them. The elder announced that everyone would gladly fulfill Russ's request, and if he had no objections, they would lead him to the Cagely Grove. Russ glanced at the people and thought that for such a tiny village the appearance of a stranger was a real sensation, so the crowd was quite expected, but looking more closely, he noticed that there were almost no children among the inhabitants. Finally, they reached the Cagely Grove. Russ looked around with admiration and said that this was a majestic forest. He turned to the people and asked if they would mind helping him gather the materials falling from the trees. The elders sternly addressed the residents. Since you are all here, start gathering the branches and fruits of Cagely and bring them here. The people quickly finished the work. Russ thanked them and said that this was quite enough. Raising a Cagely fruit, he noted with satisfaction that everything turned out as it should. Then he addressed the villagers and asked if they knew what components magical stones are made of. He explained that first and foremost a monster stone is needed, but that was not the end of it. Russ immediately unrolled several scrolls and loudly pronounced the word creation. From the crowd came a surprised question, what is he doing? They were told that these are alchemical scrolls. Someone shouted that he was using 3 creation abilities at once, and the people were impressed. Russ heard their exclamations, but did not react. He decided that most of them did not understand anything about alchemy and wanted to show the real process, but for now it was a minor matter. The boy clearly pronounced the word purification, and it echoed in the silence. Suddenly the surroundings shone, and sparks of light scattered everywhere. Russ, with a slight smile, thought that maybe it was time to boast about his special creation method. He caught tiny particles of magic in the air and formed a stone from them, instead of extracting it from monsters. He explained, ordinary stones are born in the bodies of monsters over years, when magical particles slowly crystallize in the atmosphere. Russ added that according to this principle, stones can be created by filtering the air, extracting magical particles from it, and crystallizing them, thus avoiding dangerous and costly monster hunting. Black fog thickened in the air, and Russ immediately understood. These were exactly those magical particles, extremely dense and saturated. People murmured in surprise, not understanding what was happening. Russ only thought that at least they recognized his purification scroll and guessed about the special technique. He felt only he and the universe itself could create such stones, so it was no wonder that people could not comprehend what they saw. This method was extremely important and priceless. Russ threw a Cagely fruit into the black fog. It began to transform, acquiring a new, strange form. Us thought that Cagely fruits are often added to various recipes as an auxiliary ingredient, and realized thanks to them, he could create a kind of vessel for crystallizing magical particles. The young man knelt down and whispered words that started the polishing. Immediately a strong wind rose, as if nature itself responded to his call. Someone from the crowd shouted that it was a small whirlwind. Another corrected that this is what they call a tornado. Russ smiled and thought that he did not expect such a reaction, because he hoped that creating the stone would not look too complicated. He began throwing Cagely fruits into the whirlwind, explaining that now he was filling them with magical particles, giving them the shape of the future stone. Russ pondered. For the final touch in creating a high-quality stone, one more thing was needed: perfect carving. Polishing scroll created not just a tornado, its true power was in the diamond dust swirling in the vortex. By adjusting the dust density and rotation speed, even the smallest details could be carved. Russ stretched out his hand and felt that the time had come. He began to condense the diamond dust, and a tornado grew, shining like a precious stone in the air. The girl whispered enchantedly that it was incredibly beautiful. Russ awkwardly thought that wherever he created, women always reacted the same way to the glow. He recalled the quality of a magical stone is determined by 3 things: size, power, and harmony between them. If they do not get along, the stone will be useless. Ultimately, the true power of the stone was hidden in how it was cut. Everything in creation depended on this. Fortunately, Russ remembered well the proportions of old samples and decided to adjust a little so that the stone would not be too small. He activated the scroll again and loudly pronounced the spell for the formation to begin. Russ felt that everything was almost ready, only the particles needed to be fixed in the Cagely fruit. When he looked at his palm, the newly created magical stone played with light in it. Russ squeezed it in his hand and confidently said that the work was finished. The result exceeded all his expectations, and people looked at him with surprise and could not believe that he had created the stone right before their eyes. Russ handed the elder the weapon and asked him to test it on the old H-32 model. The elder was momentarily embarrassed but still agreed. The old man carefully took the pistol, and all the villagers fixed their eyes on him. He inserted the stone, raised the weapon up, and fired. A loud explosion sounded, and the people burst into joyful cries, shouting that the stone worked and now they could live without fear. Russ smiled, looking at the happy faces, and thought that such moments proved that his efforts were not in vain. The boy said he would make a little more, summoned the scrolls, and loudly commanded, "Begin creation." Everything started simultaneously 3 sets. The people froze and watched with admiration. Before Russ appeared baskets filled with magical stones. He wiped sweat from his forehead and said with satisfaction that this would be enough, and the people, opening their mouths in amazement, stood speechless. Russ closed his eyes and thought, even for him the whole process took about an hour. Now he will teach the peasants to create stones on their own. He looked at the stones and said to the people, "From now on all this is yours." Each stone was filled to the brim with magical particles. The young man added that his stones were twice as powerful as those old samples he had supplied earlier, and the elder asked in astonishment if they were really twice as strong. The old man came closer and exclaimed with delight that there were as many as 5 baskets of stones. One village would have enough for a lifetime. He added that he must consult with the Lord. Russ looked at him with surprise. The elder cleared his throat and admitted that in all his long life he had never been so surprised. He had not even imagined such a result, and now a slight anxiety crept into him. He addressed Zara and decisively said that those stones must be delivered to the village immediately. Zara cheerfully ran up with the cart and exclaimed that he was already ready to start, and Russ glanced at the sacks in which the stones were being placed. There were an extraordinary number of them, and the young man thought that it was good that the people quickly and harmoniously divided the work among themselves. It was time to decide what to do next. The elder suggested sending those who were left without work to help gather materials, but Russ waved his hand and said that since he had already started, he would finish the job himself. He summoned the scroll again, thanked everyone for their willingness to help, and sincerely said that he was grateful for such initiative, then loudly spoke the words to begin polishing and releasing. The wind rose, lifting the materials and putting them into the sack. Russ smiled and thought that now diamond dust was no longer needed. He had reduced it to 0. The branches and fruits of Cagely swirled in a vortex. When everything was finished, he quietly and carefully laid out the materials in the sacks. Someone from the crowd shouted, "Amazing." Others began talking among themselves, enthusiastically discussing how quickly he had managed, and Russ only smiled, thinking that today the audience was very lively. The elder held his breath, watching Russ's magic. The boy asked if they could go somewhere else to talk, and the elder loudly agreed, "Of course." The old man added, "They will return soon." He looked at Zara and entrusted him to take care of everything else. He loudly replied that he would do everything properly. Russ sighed with relief and thought that the elder understood his hint from half a word. This village surprised him. Every time the people here understood each other perfectly, and with such relationships they would definitely manage, so they returned to the elder's house. He was served tea again, and Russ smiled after work. This drink seemed especially pleasant, because the feeling of completing a task, multiplied by the joy of others, had a completely different taste. Russ said he was ready to start a serious conversation, and the elder confidently replied that he was listening carefully. The young man smiled. The old man had such a stern expression, as if expecting bad news. The young man reassured him and said that the conversation was not at all about what he thought. It would be about the old stones. If even one village used them, their reserves would last for many years. The elder, stunned, asked again, "For years?" He explained that Russ was understating the significance. These stones contained so much that it would be enough for several decades. The elder admitted that he did not know how to thank for such generosity, but Russ just waved his hand and asked not to talk about it anymore. He said simply, "Such stones are needed not only by this village, but also by all the borderlands suffering from shortages." The elder confirmed indeed so. Every inhabitant of the borderlands eagerly awaits the return of the old stones. Russ said that this was exactly what their further conversation would be about. He explained that he sought to conclude an agreement on supplying the old stones to the new possessions of Lady Karin. The elder replied in surprise that he had heard about the Knight Karin from his lord. It was said that her sword with one swing could break 3 heavily armored warriors at once, and it was thanks to her that the recent wars ended in victories. He added that despite her delicate female hands, she was so strong that it was hard to call her human, hence she got the nickname. Russ raised his hand, stopping him. The young man thought that he had heard such praises more than once, but they sounded unpleasant when the girl was portrayed as a monster capable of cutting a dragon in half. He told the elder that Kareen had been his friend since their student years, and that he was now heading to her. The elder lowered his head and apologized for his harsh words. Russ explained that was exactly why he wanted the elder to personally talk to the local lord about it, because it seemed to him that the development of Karen's new lands would cost a considerable sum. He thought that one could make a good profit from this, and there should be no problems unless Karen refused to entrust him with the management of these works. Russ was confident Kareen and the local lords would agree to at least a small deal, and now the main thing was to lay a strong foundation for future relations. The boy thought he had already provided the village with the necessary stones. It was his gift, and the elder sincerely rejoiced. Russ sipped his tea. The elder nodded and sincerely said that he was infinitely grateful for the help for them. It was truly a huge support. Russ added, "I would like to write a letter." The elder shouted, "Bring paper and a pen for Mr. Russ." The young man suddenly remembered that there was one more matter. He wanted to write a letter to another school friend besides Kareen. Russ thought that he now served in the army, and the matter was about a conflict of interest around magical stones. He felt that Lee Halesome might be drawn into this. Russ recalled his face and told himself that he didn't care about him. He was much more interested in the army. During the war, they switched to a new type of magical weapon, and he thought that, of course, it brought huge profits to the army. But as soon as the flow of old stones resumed, the army would definitely want to subordinate them. Russ finished writing the letter and announced that everything was ready. The elder asked if he wanted to be sent. Russ replied that he would be grateful and pressed the medallion to the scroll, leaving an imprint on it. He stood up and, as if having finally decided, said that it was time to move. The elder stopped him and asked if he would stay for the night. Russ smiled and said he had to go. On the street, people asked in surprise if he was really leaving already. A woman with plates approached him and, with hope in her voice, asked to make them shine. A man stretched out his hand and asked, "Make my axe golden." Another jokingly asked if Russ could uproot weeds in the garden with a small tornado. Russ looked at them in surprise but still fulfilled all the requests. It was time to set off. He said goodbye to everyone, called Bejemat, and they moved on. Finally, they reached the border. Russ, sitting on Bejemat, looked around and said he did not expect this. The rumors turned out to be exaggerated. There were no living plants or animals here, only monsters. But the wasteland turned out to be inhabited by strange creatures and plants that Russ had never seen before, and although he did not know if they were dangerous, a feeling of hidden threat tightened in his chest. Suddenly, some strange creature flew at them, but Bejemat managed to step on it and crush it. Russ jumped down, petted the beast on the head, and thanked him, then added that the hippopotamus senses hostility, and this ability is incredibly useful right now. The young man examined the crushed creature and did not hide his surprise, asking what it was. Then he said that a sample needed to be taken, took out gloves for collection and waterproof bags, because he decided that the material might come in handy. Putting together the remains of the strange creature, Russ sighed heavily and thought that this area really is a wasteland. Monsters have driven out all other life from here. He glanced at the sack, smiled, and thought that if there were so many monsters unknown to him here, the research promised to be very interesting. Russ unfolded the map and said that, judging by it, there should be a body of water ahead, and as soon as they passed it, they would be almost near Karen and the meeting would be very close. He sat on Behemoth again and they moved on. When they reached the body of water, Russ patted the beast and said they would make a stop. Then he approached the water and wondered if there were monsters in the pond. The young man listened to strange sounds and instantly became alert. Black smoke rose from the water. Russ thought with surprise that it was a fluctuation of a magical element, but why here? Suddenly something jumped out of the water. The creature suddenly lunged at Russ, but he managed to jump back. Looking around, he saw a small lizard offspring and thought with surprise that it looked quite harmless. Russ looked closely at the lizard and recognized it as a rare species, but suddenly strange sounds came from the water again, and tentacles began to crawl out from the depths. They lunged at Russ and he began to dodge, but suddenly he noticed that the tentacles were not hitting him but the small lizard, and he thought uncertainly that the target was this very beast. The little creature looked at Russ pleadingly, as if asking for help, and their eyes met. The boy hesitated. Although it looked like a defenseless child, it still remained a monster, and its appearance gave no guarantee of safety. Russ continued to watch closely as the tentacles struck the lizard, and thought that sometimes this could be just a trick to dull vigilance. In the world of monsters, the strong always devours the weak. That is the law of nature. The lizard looked at him with pleading eyes again, and Russ tried to hold back but could not resist and gave in to pity. He decided not to leave it to its fate. Russ called Behemoth for help, and the magical beast roared loudly, jumping onto the tentacles. The lizard looked back at the Behemoth in horror, who could easily crush her, but he stepped right on the tentacles and tore them to pieces. Part of the tentacles remained on the ground, and the rest hid under the water. Russ sincerely thanked the beast for the help, and again took out gloves and bags. He carefully touched the lizard. She showed no signs of life. Russ thought she was unresponsive, but that by no means meant the beast was dead. He lifted part of the tentacle and grimaced in disgust. Russ hesitated whether to use it as material. The boy unrolled a magical scroll and covered the lizard with it, spoke the activation words, unfolding, decoding, manifestation, and the scroll read the information and returned the result to him. Russ looked at the records and thought that perhaps due to the difference between humans and animals, this data was hard to read. Then he admitted that the issue was not this, but blocked access. He pointed at the scroll and joyfully exclaimed that the information had now become clear. The lizard was in a state of complete exhaustion. Her mitochondrial activity had dropped to almost zero, so understanding her true condition was extremely difficult. Meanwhile, the behemoth decided to climb into the water. Russ noticed this and warned him to be careful, and he himself returned to the lizard, who still lay unconscious. He thought that in such a state, no quality potion could be made from her. It was then that the behemoth again rushed into battle with the tentacles, and Russ was so deeply immersed in research that he did not immediately notice this. He decided that in such a situation, it was better to limit himself to only safe potions. Finally, the behemoth emerged from the water with a piece of tentacle in his mouth. Russ exclaimed in surprise that it was the same monster. Then he quickly prepared a potion and dropped a few drops on the lizard. He watched her closely, but nothing changed. Russ said confusedly that the little one still had not woken up. Russ glanced once more at the scroll and said that the level of mitochondrial activity had clearly increased. It almost reached the indicators of an ordinary person. The boy continued to think that the ultimate goal of the creature was much higher than he had imagined, and this difference was truly impressive. Behemoth carefully touched the lizard. Russ was surprised. The beast is rarely friendly to a monster. It is too sensitive to hostility and malice. But isn't this lizard one of those monsters? If left as is, the chances of saving it are almost none. He thought that this body of water was in the middle of the desert, and there were plenty of monsters around. The disappearance of the tentacled monster could attract others, and if the lizard was abandoned, it would die. Russ glanced at Behemoth and decisively said that they would take it with them. They moved on, and the young man unfolded the map, and holding his breath, thought for a long time about where to go until he decided they should follow the flow of the river that flowed out of this watering place. Behemoth stopped in front of a small settlement spread out in the middle of the steppe, and Russ, freezing with excitement, recognized it as the camp of Corin, where they had been walking for so long. Behemoth began to make strange sounds, and the boy asked in surprise what was happening. He climbed down from the beast's back, took out a medallion, and loudly exclaimed, "My name is Russ. I am a master rank alchemist. I have arrived by invitation of the Night Corin and asked to be let in." The sand before him stirred, and girls with faces covered by cloth emerged from it. They held spears in their hands, ready to defend the lands from enemies. Russ looked at them with surprise, and one of the girls smiled and said that they were glad to welcome him, but due to danger at the border, monsters often disguise themselves as humans, so they had to check. The boy suddenly realized this was exactly what Behemoth had warned him about. If they had come any closer, they would have been in the attack zone, and disaster could have happened. Russ smiled and kindly assured the girls that everything was fine. They had indeed disguised themselves skillfully, and the blindfolds were created by magic. They said they did not know how to act covertly, but he noticed them effortlessly anyway. Now it became clear why Lady Corinne valued him so highly. The girl admitted that the blindfolds were actually just ordinary pieces of cloth. Russ's eyes caught the blue and red patterns on their blindfolds, and he immediately thought they looked like magical items, so he wondered why they needed them. One of the girls noticed a lizard on Behemoth's back and shouted that some kind of monster was sitting on him. Her friend shouted Roa and begged her to calm down, but she sharply replied, "My name is Ari," added that all this was very strange, and doubtfully said whether they should let Master Russ in because of that creature he might be dangerous. Roa whispered uncertainly that everything was fine, and Ari looked at Russ and apologized for her sister. The young man said it was nothing serious, and thought with relief that it was good the matter did not escalate into a senseless fight. He definitely did not want to get into trouble at the start of a new case. Russ looked closely at Ari and felt that she probably had some special gift of sight. Perhaps it was the younger sister who noticed their approach from afar, and he was curious whether she could read others' abilities. He suddenly remembered the lizard and decided that the white creature still did not give him peace. Russ hid the medallion and broke into a broad smile. He told the girls that he understood them perfectly and fully shared their caution, and took full responsibility for the white lizard, just as for his alchemist's mark. The girls sincerely thanked him for his words, smiled, and said that now he had to follow them. They would lead him to Lady Corin, who was already waiting impatiently. They approached the large tent. The girl waved her hand and asked him to come inside. Russ entered and politely apologized for the trouble. Inside it was crowded. People were bustling over various projects. One man was ordering colleagues to send documents faster. He was shouted back that feedback had arrived from point D, and others reported that points A and G were already out of contact for the fifth time. Russ long observed and realized that before him was real communication equipment. Now it became clear to him. This was their information control center. Suddenly a girl broke out of the crowd and joyfully exclaimed that Russ had finally arrived. He smiled back at her. They firmly shook each other's hands. Corin said with a smile that they had been waiting for him. She began waving her hands and laughing, added that they had not seen each other for a very long time. Then, smiling, she asked if he had aged during that time. Russ deeply sighed, fatigue in his voice. This is completely inappropriate, so Mrs. Corin should stop. The girl laughed and said that he had not changed at all, and Russ added that despite the remoteness of these lands, getting here was surprisingly easy. Corin looked at Ari and Roa and asked if they had already met him, then smiled broadly and inquired if Russ had encountered any problems. Russ glanced at the girls. They immediately turned away, and he thought with surprise that it was they who had come out to meet him. The young man immediately understood the matter. If a problem flared up between him and the camp, these two would take the risk upon themselves and resolve the conflict from within. Therefore, they were the first to face the danger. Russ scratched the back of his head and decided that he did not have to blindly follow Karin until everything became clear. He said directly that there were no problems. The girl beamed with a smile and joyfully said that this was wonderful news. She approached the magical machine and sharply said that enough with empty talk. Russ should come closer. Karin addressed her people and loudly ordered a break. Everyone looked at her in surprise but obediently stopped working. The staff left the tent. Karin briefly said that there was no table, so she would have to make one herself. She moved the devices with magic and freed the drawers, and Russ thought that she had not changed at all. The girls smiled cheerfully and said that this was enough, called Roa and Ari to bring tea, and sat opposite Russ herself. The young man awkwardly asked why she had so carefully sent everyone out, as if it was some kind of problem. She replied with a smile that this was exactly what she expected from him without long digressions. He immediately gets down to business. Russ smiled slyly and asked if he was right when he assumed that she wanted to be alone. He added that he once dreamed of a carefree life as a researcher in a world without magic, where the sun quietly sets, but it turned out quite differently. Karin replied that this was why they needed to get rid of excess magic, otherwise they would not wait for the dawn of the harvest, and she doubted whether she really addressed him with such a simple task. She explained, first he would have to start treating the local disease that was spreading through the camp. Karin asked him to find out the cause of the outbreak. She said that a tent had already been prepared for him. He could use it at his own discretion. Russ replied that this was wonderful and went out together with Behemoth, who stayed close to avoid getting lost in unfamiliar territory. The boy thought, what does local disease mean? Are these symptoms that appeared only after arriving at the camp? But before drawing conclusions, he needed to carefully examine how the ailment manifests. Suddenly, Russ felt that all the locals were looking straight at him. He smiled broadly and greeted them, but tensely thought that their eyes looked wary. People silently dispersed, and Russ understood. They were too cautious. He would have to fight not only the disease, but also earn the trust of these people. The girls led him to the tent, and Ari said that this was now the dwelling of Master Russ. The boy smiled and looked at them. He thought how lucky he was to have met them first. Roa said she would not take her eyes off him. She thundered that she would not forgive him the disgrace of Lady Karin. Ari angrily called out to her sister, demanding silence. Russ only thought that he had wrongly expected an easy acquaintance. He gently stroked Behemoth and smiled. It was good that he got a separate tent, although it turned out to be much larger than he had hoped. Someone shouted that a great master had arrived, and Russ instantly understood. This was an unspoken signal for the entire camp, an accurate assessment of the situation. Entering the tent, he looked around and noticed that there was no furniture, only bare earth. He thought that Karin knew his habits well. Before Ari and her sister bring the first patients here, Russ pulled out a scroll and said that they needed to prepare properly. He whispered words of purification and imagined, if he laid it on the fabric and spread it on the floor, it would be perfect. This way he would protect the space from dust and moisture. Russ carefully placed the lizard on the fabric so it would not be injured while he arranged the room. He said that temporarily it would stay here. The boy took out magical materials and said that their time had come. He touched the scroll and loudly pronounced the words of unfolding and manifestation of the rose. Near the sleeping lizard, a beautiful alchemical rose blossomed. Russ knelt down and thought that, despite the fragile appearance, this creature could be no less useful than Behemoth, and he turned to the alchemical rose to strengthen the sleeping place for this baby. The rose entwined the blanket on which the lizard lay with its thorny stems, creating a kind of cage that protected it with sharp spikes. Russ sincerely thanked her and said that everything turned out wonderfully. Now it remained only to arrange the tent so that it resembled a regular camp. Secretly from everyone, he began to mentally recite the plan for the arrangement. First, he crafted the floor warm and ventilated so that air could circulate freely. Then he took on the bed frame, a chair, a writing desk, and another one for experiments, because he had already made similar constructions during his student years. They helped him during field research, and he always took them with him on expeditions. Now, it had become a pleasant memory of those times when Kareen and a few friends were always with him. Suddenly, an unfamiliar man looked into the tent and reported that they had brought a sick person. Russ nodded in agreement and thought that his real work was finally beginning. He immediately got to work, carefully listened to complaints, checked symptoms, and selected the necessary potions. The whole day was spent on diagnosis and treatment. At first, temporary measures had to be taken, but the main priority was full recovery. If the root of the disease could be identified, the research could be conducted gradually. One patient said he felt numbness in his right hand, and Russ was so surprised that he almost staggered. He assumed that this could be a sign of paralysis. He examined the hand and realized the condition was much more serious than he had imagined. For this man, a real battle for his own health was beginning. After him, Ari called Roa to bring the next patient. Time flew, the day turned into evening, and then night came. Roa entered the tent and said, "This is the last patient for today." She could not help but note how quickly Russ was working. He smiled and thanked her for the help, and by the end of the day, he managed to provide initial treatment to all the patients. But the last patient complained of fatigue and partial numbness in the hands and feet, and Russ replied that he would prepare a potion to restore normal condition and personally monitor the progress of changes. He carefully examined the unique features of each case and prepared auxiliary potions, applying symptomatic therapy. He felt that it was necessary to identify the root of the problem as soon as possible because delaying treatment could lead to irreversible consequences. The patient drank the potion and exclaimed with delight that his hands were moving again, then thanked the doctor. Russ replied that it was wonderful, but in fact he was not a doctor. He could hardly believe that even a simple potion could cause so much joy. He would never have felt this in the association itself. Russ turned to Roa and sincerely thanked her for today's work. She modestly replied that she was just doing her duty, and Russ smiled. He handed her a vial and said that it contained a potion against fatigue, which she could share with Ari. Roa asked in surprise, "When did you manage to make it?" Russ replied that he had a few free minutes. She thanked him embarrassedly and quickly ran out of the tent. Russ thought that it was hard for her to open up to others, so he decided to just be patient, then remembered that he had one more task for today. He needed to prepare an interim report for Kareen, so he took out a scroll and began carefully noting the results of the examinations and the symptoms identified. He added his previous conclusions about the possible cause of the disease to the report, put on his jacket, left the tent with the finished document in his hands, and mentally reminded himself to mention the topic of magical stones next time. Russ put down the report and looked up at the sky, wondering how it had suddenly gotten dark. Suddenly, two men called out to him and thanked him for his help. One of them said he had no idea that Russ would get so many people back on their feet in half a day, a true friend of Lady Karin. Russ remembered how during the day he had only received wary glances. Now he raised his head and wished them to take care of themselves. He approached the tent and introduced himself as an alchemist who had come with a report on the course of treatment. Russ asked the guard to inform Lady Karin, but he just waved his hand and said to come in. Kareen, turning to the entrance, asked what had happened since it was already late. Russ replied that he had completed the initial treatment and handed over a brief report. Kareen was surprised that he had managed it in just half a day and exclaimed with admiration that he was incredible, as always. Kareen noted that the report was indeed excellent, but it clearly mentioned the possibility of irreversible damage, and Russ nodded, agreeing that this was the case. Karin whispered that she was infinitely grateful to him for saving her people. Russ was quite surprised. Even a few simple words from Kareen sounded like sincere gratitude. He bowed and replied that he was just doing what he must, and from now on would work side by side with everyone. Perrin laughed and said he was right, then changed the subject. She said she was going to have a snack, noticed that he had eaten nothing, and invited him to join, promising to take care of a treat for two. Russ nodded and admitted that all this time he had been holding on only because he always took with him on the road between patient appointments, and Karin laughed, recalling his herbal briquettes, and asked if he still ate them. Could he really not afford something better? Suppressing her laughter, she admitted that she hadn't laughed so sincerely in a long time. Wiping a tear, Karin pointed to the report and said she wanted to hear more details. While they waited for the food, Russ agreed and began to explain. The next morning at breakfast, Russ looked at the cage. The white lizard still hadn't woken up. He threw on his jacket, went outside, and was surprised to see Ari and Roa near his tent. He smiled, greeted them, and wished them good morning, asking how they felt after yesterday. Roa said that thanks to his efforts everything was fine. Ari thanked him for the potion, and her sister reminded that it was he who had given it to her. There was no trace left of their fatigue. The effect was amazing, and Russ thought he would like to see their faces. Surely, they were shining with happiness. Ari and Roa explained that Lady Karin had ordered them to accompany him today and show him the surroundings, after which they asked where he would like to start. Russ pondered. He replied that first he wanted to see where the food supplies were kept. The girls nodded and led him along. But before leaving, Russ called Behemoth, and a huge beast appeared before them. The young man noticed that the guides were clearly amused by this spectacle. They approached the storeroom in Karin's camp, and Ari and Roa explained that this was their storage. They rushed to call the manager, and Russ glanced around the building and thought that the storage looked more like a dugout, probably a former monster's lair converted into a storeroom, and from the point of view of material economy, it was quite a smart decision. Russ knelt down and asked Behemoth to warn him if he noticed anything, after which he opened his bag and took out a deployment scroll. He pulled out a biolocation pendulum from it, a device for measuring the concentration of magical energy. Russ thought the stronger the oscillations, the higher the concentration. The data collected by the pendulum was transmitted to the scrolls for decoding. So they started with the area around the warehouse. Russ sat down and began to swing the pendulum. He noticed that the ground here was literally saturated with magical particles, so no microorganisms could survive. Therefore, the environment was considered sterile. Russ was surprised to see how Ari and Roa bent down and, like Behemoth, began sniffing the ground and quietly whispered that they were really helping him with all their might. Later, he approached the cliff and touched it. Russ felt a high concentration of magical particles but found nothing suspicious. When choosing a place to store food, not only coolness and darkness are important, such an arrangement of the warehouse brings the greatest benefit and is already considered standard practice. Russ imagined various products and thought that such saturation with magical particles could even help destroy bacteria and make food safer. He could hardly imagine that local microorganisms could enter the human body through food, so the cause was probably hidden in something else, perhaps in the remains of a monster that once lived here. Russ, not hiding his curiosity, asked Roa if it was true that this cave was the lair of a monster, then feverishly clarified which one exactly. Sniffing the air, Roa replied that it was probably a bear's den. He continued to inquire about the properties of this bear. At that moment, Ari approached them, bringing the warehouse manager with her. He warmly greeted Russ and sincerely thanked him for helping his brother, who had previously suffered from numbness in his limbs and was in despair, but thanks to Russ is now recovering. The steward inquired how he could repay and promised to do everything possible. Russ recognized in his brother one of yesterday's patients and, smiling, replied that it was wonderful. He asked for permission to inspect the storeroom itself. The manager raised an eyebrow in surprise. Was that necessary? But eventually agreed. They went inside, and Russ began swinging the pendulum, carefully searching for the traces he needed. Russ discovered in the storeroom meat of monsters and fruits and resources from plant monsters, carefully processed, and could not believe his eyes. Everything was remarkably well preserved. In addition, no trace of poisoning, no hint of the former inhabitant in the lair he found. Russ thanked the steward Ren and said that the storage could be locked. Ren was surprised and asked if that was all. Suddenly, Behemoth barked and called Russ. He, approaching in surprise, asked what his friend had found, and upon learning, sincerely thanked him. And so it became clear the cause of the disease outbreak was not in this place at all. Russ stepped back and said that it was too early to draw final conclusions first. All the surrounding areas needed to be examined sequentially. Roa asked where they would go next, and Russ sharply raised the scroll, pointed into the distance, and announced that the next place would be that one. He meant the reservoir that purifies drinking water. The steward explained that this tank was for drinking and cooking, and due to limited supplies, the council decided to divide the water in portions among all the sections. Russ carefully checked the scroll. The words were confirmed. Although the reservoir did not look like an old magical instrument, it faithfully performed its purification function. He noticed nothing suspicious in its components. It seemed that numbness was caused by toxins that entered the body through water or food, so he first checked the food supplies, and Russ frowned and whispered that solving this mystery would not be easy. Suddenly, Roa, coming too close, suggested taking a lunch break, and this slightly frightened Russ. He muttered confusedly that it was indeed a good idea. Roa laughed and noted that when he was deep in thought, he did not hear what was being said to him at all. Russ grimaced and thought that arguing with this was pointless. He found it strange to receive a lunch invitation from these two. Recovering, he said he understood. Suddenly, he sharply asked if Karin had instructed them to watch over him and force him to eat, and Russ raised his hand and assured Ari and Roa, "Don't worry, I'll take care of myself." He remembered his student years, when Kareen often literally stuffed food into his mouth while working on projects, so now he promised to listen and actually have lunch. They moved forward, and Roa suggested grabbing a snack at the camp canteen. Ari explained the food is prepared in that tent and eaten here, so she would go get the portions. Roa also decided to go. Russ smiled and said he was glad to rely on them. He glanced aside and joked that Behemoth was probably hungry too. He took a potion from his pocket and with one motion turned the crushed magical stones into a plate. He waved to the beast, calling it to start eating after all. Creatures created by alchemy also suffer when they receive too many or too few magical particles. Behemoth suddenly lunged at the food, and just then Ari and Roa returned with their portions. Russ noticed that although the menu was simple, the cook's ingenuity was felt, so he could enjoy the lunch. He inquired whether everyone in the camp ate here, and Ari replied that no many ate at home with their families, and here mostly loners. Russ tasted the food, and immediately thought its flavor seemed to take him back to the student canteen from the past. Finishing, he took out a scroll and began reading it. He calmly flipped through the lines, but suddenly felt Ari and Roa looking at him through their bandages. Russ realized their gazes reached him even though no eyes were visible. They seemed to want to say something. He asked if they had noticed that similarity among the patients, and if they knew about new cases today. Ari replied that he should at least rest a bit during lunch. That day there were no new patients, and she hadn't noticed similar symptoms. Russ thanked her, and Roa immediately noticed that among the patients there were many loners. Ari confirmed, of course not all, but this trait is really noticeable. Roa said she mostly brought people from solitary tents to him, and Russ summarized, they are all loners. He asked Ari if mostly loners ate here. She nodded that was the case. Russ unrolled a scroll over the food and ordered it to be deciphered, and the contents revealed. Ari asked anxiously what happened. Russ looked at the scroll, smiled, and exclaimed that he had found the cause. He loudly ordered the girls to stop eating immediately. Even a tiny dose of the monster's poison was hidden in the dishes and affected the nervous system, which is why the symptoms matched so closely. Ari jumped up and shouted for everyone in the camp to stop their meal immediately, there might be poison there. Russ smiled lightly and said he understood everything. He was sure he had seen this before. Roa asked if he really had learned something. The boy nodded and replied yes. He recalled that most of the sick lived in solitary tents and ate in the dining hall. There were no problems with the drinking water reservoir, so he was almost certain of the solution. Ari asked in surprise if he had already understood everything. Roa asked with interest to explain. At that moment, the cook approached and anxiously asked what was wrong with the food. Russ apologized for the abrupt interference and introduced himself as an alchemist on a mission from Lady Kareen, investigating the outbreak of a local disease. They entered the kitchen, which was drowning in plates and dishes, and Russ unrolled the scroll and noted that the indicators were exactly what he expected. He asked Roa to deliver this message to Karin, and the cook to fulfill his request as soon as possible. The girl agreed. Russ smiled and said, "In an hour we will meet near Lady Karin's tent. There I will explain everything." In an hour everyone gathered near Karin's tent. Even those responsible for the kitchen and the loners' tents came over, and Karin allowed Russ to begin. She directly asked if the problem was really solved, and Russ confirmed, first asking to explain the root cause. He said that nearby, upstream of the river, there is a pond where a monster Livesit's poison attacks the nervous system. Karin listened attentively. She confirmed yes, they really use river water, but even their old reservoir should be able to handle purification and neutralize toxins. Russ nodded. The water in the reservoir was well purified, so the problem was not with it. Karin asked with interest, what then was the reason? He explained that it was not about drinking water, but about the one used for household chores. Karin exclaimed excitedly, exactly. Russ confirmed the dishes in the kitchen and the laundry in the washroom were washed with plain river water. When he looked into the bachelors' tents, the same traces of toxin were also found there. The poison slowly accumulated in the body through food and contact with the skin. Ari sadly added that that was why singles suffered the most, because they ate in the canteen. The cook began to apologize in despair, and the person responsible for the singles' tents offered to take the blame, but Kareen raised her hand and strictly ordered not to repent. She said that she herself decided to save purified water and gave the order to distribute it that way, so these people were not to blame. Then Kareen loudly declared that now everyone understood how to act. The standards in all sections needed to be reviewed, and the monster living in the pond dealt with. Russ smiled and noted that there was no need to worry about the tentacled monster anymore. He and Behemoth accidentally dealt with it when it was bathing in the reservoir. Everyone stared at him, their eyes wide with shock. Russ awkwardly clarified that it happened completely by accident, and Kareen was horrified and asked if he, by any chance, could foresee the future. Russ waved it off and decisively replied no. He pointed to a scroll with magical symbols and added that the composition of the poison completely matched. Karen said she could hardly believe her ears. He not only cured the sick overnight, but the next day found the cause and even destroyed the source of the infection. Russ added, his voice hushed. It was better not to use river water. Temporarily, all of it should be poured out for household needs. Karen agreed with relief. The source of the infection was already eliminated, and in a few days the water could be used again, and Roa asked Behemoth if there were any more such monsters left in the pond. Russ felt that he had finally fulfilled Lady Karen's order, found the cause of the disease, and cured the people. Kareen smiled with relief. Corin waved her hand and loudly announced that Master Russ had brilliantly coped with the task, exceeding all her expectations, and doing what she could not even imagine. She sincerely thanked him. Russ smiled and explained that the poison seeped slowly, gradually accumulated in the body, and eventually led to illness, so in some people its effects might appear later. The young man said that if the condition of the victims changed, he was ready to continue treatment, just inform him. Corin replied that it would be so, and Russ thought that now was the right moment to make a few requests. Suddenly, he remembered the water purification reservoir and asked if they planned to expand it. Russ raised his index finger, a spark flashed in his eyes, and with a smile he declared, if he was allocated funds, he would personally take care of it. Karen agreed he would receive funding. Thus ended Russ's first mission in the new position, entrusted to him by Lady Karen. It seemed that finally one could live peacefully far from the city bustle, but Russ was not so optimistic. He had no idea what was happening now in the Alchemical Association. The story is now told by Ari, and she introduced herself again. She serves in the Admiralty under the leadership of Lady Karen. Her name is Ari Saad. Roa's sister approached her and said she was thinking about Master Russ. Ari added that they were now in an alley known as Potter Street. The girl thought their task was to buy bottles for water, and by the sizes indicated by Master Russ, they turned out to be quite large, and Ari joked that he was a bit eccentric. She recalled that first glance at Russ and immediately felt his combat skills were simply incredible. Even if she and Roa rushed at him together, they would not avoid defeat. Moreover, his alchemical behemoth would not leave them any chance at all, and for the sisters this was a real shock. They proudly boasted about Roa. Among Karen's subordinates, they were considered the best, and probably because of this, Ari was tormented by such conflicting emotions towards Russ. Roa said that his strength aroused envy. Ari thought that her sister was proud of all their training, but also a person with such completely different alchemy skills from theirs interested her. As the older sister, Ari should have condemned her for these thoughts, but she could not because somewhere deep in her soul she felt the same feelings, only hiding them. Ari pointed to the shop and asked what she thought about it. They went inside, ordered a batch of bottles, and left an address for delivery, and the seller thanked them for the purchase. On another street, the air was much tenser than on Hancharna. People walked gloomily. Ari stated that she did not feel any harmful influence, but Roa insisted that she did feel it. Ari explained that it was only a premonition. They wondered why, perhaps because there were so many magical shops around, so they decided to enter the one they had marked. Inside, they were greeted by a young girl with a radiant smile who asked how she could help. Ari recalled that it was this very shop that Master Russ had mentioned. She looked closely at the saleswoman. She was very young. Magical tools stood on the shelves, although some shelves remained empty. Ari said that they wanted to sell something. The saleswoman was initially surprised but quickly smiled and asked who they had come from. Her black eyes carefully scanned the girls. Ari thought it was an appraising look. From their clothes, it was immediately clear they did not look like alchemists. Then Ari took out a scroll and placed it on the table. The saleswoman unfolded the message, and Master Russ's seal immediately caught her eye. She asked in surprise if they were really his messengers. Ari confirmed. She said that Russ had sent them to sell a bottle of potion and asked if the shop would accept the goods. The woman loudly replied, yes, potions of such quality are very rare nowadays. She added that all the potions created by Master Russ were always of excellent quality, yet something still troubled her. Roa sharply asked what the matter was. The woman explained the document stated a fixed sale price and even included a clause that sales could only be made at that price. Ari confirmed this was an instruction from Master Russ himself and asked if the saleswoman was dissatisfied with this condition. She sharply objected, quite the opposite. Prices for alchemical goods are soaring now because deliveries from the association are severely delayed. Such potions would now cost much more. Ari felt that the shop owner was speaking too frankly, and now everything became clear. No wonder Master Russ vouched for her. She said they were satisfied with everything and at the usual price. The woman smiled, replied that she understood, and immediately prepared the money for the purchase. Leaving the shop, the girls took a heavy pouch of coins from the saleswoman and Roa raised her eyebrows in surprise, saying there was indeed a lot of money here. Ari confirmed and said she still couldn't believe it was just the set price. She added that nothing else was to be expected from Master Russ, since it was his potion, and Roa noted that they were instructed to use these funds for the journey. Ari looked at her sister, who immediately asked what she wanted. Ari smiled and said she wanted to try something tasty, and Roa cheerfully shook her head in agreement. They entered a coffee shop. Roa immediately grabbed the food, and Ari, looking at her, recalled that the event that led them to this task had happened just yesterday, although in reality, a day and a half had passed. The girl winced in memory. Before Master Russ arrived, Kareen had called several healers to them, but they all eventually gave up, unable to cope with the illness. Some, afraid of infection, simply fled. Presumably, they were the ones who spread the rumors. The Healers Guild continued to refuse, putting the camp in a critical situation. Only the arrival of Master Russ saved everyone, as if by the wave of a magic hand. By Kareen's instruction, they divided the sick camp inmates among themselves and led them to be examined by Master Russ, while some were barely moving. Their arms and legs were completely numb. Others were delirious from fever, but as soon as the next patient came out of Russ's tent, he already looked fresh and full of strength. In a matter of moments, Russ not only restored the health of the suffering, he discovered the true cause of the ailment and destroyed the monster that caused it, so Master Russ seemed special even among alchemists. Ari quietly whispered to Roa that they could ask Russ to help with their eyes. Roa froze. The spoon stopped in her hands. Their eyes met through the fabric of the bandages, and they silently nodded. For the first time in a long while, they had hoped to remove these bandages. The story shifts to Lagelsum. He entered a special warehouse of the Alchemists Association and froze. The entire room was covered in slime. He exclaimed in shock and pulled out a special vacuum cleaner to start cleaning, muttering curses. Why did he have to deal with this, and in such a terrible state? Lagelsum angrily decided that Russ was to blame for everything, who did not appreciate the association, and thought that lately they had too many problems, so masters had to leave their posts. Because among the preserved materials, there were many deadly dangerous things that required extreme caution. Some monster samples could explode at the slightest touch. Once a specialist managed the warehouse, but due to budget cuts he was fired. Instead, oversight of the warehouse was assigned to the Department of Fundamental Research. Lagels angrily added that when this department was disbanded, the dangerous materials were left unattended, and troubles came one after another. Now even the slime of mutated creatures explodes in the storage. He thundered that access here is restricted. First-class threat materials are stored here, which only a master can handle. If not for this requirement, he would have long sent his subordinates. A young man named Tortake ran into the room, shouting that a serious problem had arisen. Lagelsum looked at him angrily and sharply asked what had happened. Ed was extremely busy. Tortake, gasping, said that the vice president of the Arms Association urgently summons him. Lagelsum loudly exclaimed that this was exactly where one should have started. He looked over the piles of slime and grumbled that if some master did return, let him finish everything himself. Tortake, covering his nose with his hand from the disgusting stench, whispered uncertainly that he could not do it himself, and Lagelsum only threw an irritated glance at him and sharply left, leaving the boy completely confused. Tortake muttered bitterly, "It's funny, when a newcomer is not even allowed to point out the mess to the masters, and who knows when someone will come back here to restore order." He went out into the corridor and said tiredly that at least the door should be closed so that the magical elements would not seep outside, and as soon as he touched it, the sign flashed. With annoyance, Tortake understood. The doors were sealed, and without the master's medallion they could not be unlocked. Powerless, he looked at them for a long time, then only sighed heavily and left. He decided to stand at the entrance to the association and wait until at least one of the masters returned, while in the meantime, Lagels was already walking to the office of the vice president of the Gun Arms Association. Enraged, he thundered at the subordinate, demanding to explain how much longer they would have to wait. All deadlines had long passed. The assistant tried to justify himself. Supposedly, most of the materials for the transformations were delayed on the way. Gan, enraged, exploded. "These are my problems. Everything is written to the second in the contract, and the equipment and materials were supposed to already be in the army, ready for the new war." He sharply looked at the servant and ordered to immediately call Lagelsum. At that moment, the master himself, Lagelsum, ran into the office, out of breath and apologizing for being late. Gan and his assistant felt a sharp stench trailing Lagelsum. The man began to approach to ask something, but the vice president angrily shouted at him to stop right there. Gan, seized by rage, barked, "Is this now the norm when the master alchemist comes to a meeting with an influential partner looking like this?" The assistant added that Lee Halesum smelled incredibly disgusting. Lagelsum sniffed the jacket sleeve and suddenly realized it was all because of the slime in the storage. He rushed here at full speed and only freshened up a bit, but apparently he was so used to the stench that he no longer felt it. Lagelsum awkwardly apologized to Gan and offered to go change immediately, but the vice president thundered that he would wait no longer. He demanded the promise to be fulfilled here and now. Lagelsum looked intently at Sabas, the very boy Gan had just shouted at, and tried with his gaze to find out what was going on and if there was any progress at all. Sabas pressed his hand to his nose and mouth, turned away, and gestured as if to say, "Everything is fine." Lagelsum informed Gan that everything would be ready by tomorrow. Gan shouted so that everyone could hear. He was counting on this and would not accept any excuses. Sabas was stunned because completing this task by tomorrow was absolutely impossible. They were on the verge of failure. They entered the weapons alchemy department, where work was bustling. People whispered that Master Lagelsum had summoned even those who had a day off, and no one understood what he was planning. Lagelsum declared without hesitation, the magical transformation schematics of attributes must be delivered to the Arms Association as soon as possible. He placed his hope on Sabas and demanded no delay. Sabas confirmed. They ordered outlines that transform magical elements into fire. Obviously, the army needed firearms from the Arms Association. Lagelsum sharply asked, why was the delivery delayed? He was not doing this for the first time. Precise calculations were well known to him. Sabas answered with a sigh. The reason was a shortage of distilled water, as it is the main component when applying schematics to the boards. Lee Hales exclaimed, are they lacking distilled water? But that's the simplest element. Its creation is taught even to freshmen, even apprentices manage it. Whispers arose around, and suddenly Tordek approached, handing Lagelsum a board and a device for checking circuits. He explained that this board was made from distilled water they prepared themselves. Lagelsum inserted it into the device and asked what the problem was then. He assured that the crystal had enough elements, it only needed activation, and the magic should have turned into fire, but after activation nothing happened. Lagelsum sadly stated that the crystal lacked energy, and the radiation of magical particles was unstable. Tordek agreed with regret. He added, as a last resort, they could use Master Russ's distilled water. It really is perfect for purification. Lagelsum slammed his fist on the table and forbade even mentioning that name. The staff thought with horror that his envy of Russ was crossing all limits. He decisively announced that he would create water far superior to Russ's. The work must be completed at all costs, or great problems would arise. After a few hours, he returned with a case full of distilled water. Sabas approached with documents and reported that here were all the measurement results. Lee Hales turned away and asked if the indicators exceeded the norm. Sabas replied that they were only slightly above the minimum, but did not reach the safe limit, so the product quality could seriously suffer. He explained one mistake and the reputation of the entire association would be at risk. Looking at these data, he was increasingly convinced how perfect Master Russ's water was. Moreover, Lagelsum spent many times more time creating it, but he was afraid to say this aloud, otherwise the consequences could be unpredictable. Sabas said that the indicators still correspond to the standard. Lagelsum cut dryly, continue working. Sabas thought wearily that everything was as usual. Tordek complained that he was exhausted, and night had long since fallen outside. He had a feeling that he had forgotten something, and suddenly, the warehouse door flew off its hinges with a crash, and slime crawled out from inside. The boy with his heart in his throat realized the storage doors had been left open. The slime absorbed magical elements and began to move. It was a real disaster. People screamed, recognizing the carrion slime in it. It grew, absorbing new portions of energy. Sabas shouted for everyone to grab anything and hid it. He himself grabbed a device with magical circuits and summoned fire. A desperate battle flared up, slime against alchemical fire. Lagelsum shouted loudly, the necessary circuits are in the wooden chest. They must be delivered at all costs, regardless of anything. Lagelsum continued to shout loudly for everyone to stop this chaos, but in the confusion someone slipped and fell right into the slime. People rushed to pull him out, and he was covered in sticky mass, with only torn rags left of his clothes. They began cleaning the department as best they could. Someone, completely exhausted, whispered that they had finally finished here, though they could barely stand, and a suffocating stench hung in the air and everything looked terrible. Someone asked where Lagels had gone, and they heard in response that he had left, all smeared with slime. At that moment a girl named Skinny entered the room, and Sabas whispered with relief that it was good she had finally come. He told her directly, this is urgent, the magical circuits must be delivered to the Arms Association tomorrow morning. She can use a transformed beast to transport them. Skinny approached the boxes and asked if they just needed to take all of it. Glancing around the department, she said wearily that they better hurry and finish the job. The story then shifts to Karine. Her morning began at dawn, and upon waking she noticed her tousled hair and did not bother to fix it. She decided let everything be settled later. barely getting up, she immediately had breakfast. She liked a well-cooked steak the most. Unfortunately, there was little provision here, so she ate the same simple snacks as her subordinates, then went to train with them, and afterwards washed the sweat off herself. Later, she took on paperwork, but as soon as new problems emerged, she smiled and assured everyone that everything would be fine. In dreams, the war came again. She squeezed the hand of a wounded comrade and repeated that everything would pass. The enemy was already destroyed. Now he could rest. This is how her nights passed. Waking up intermittently, Corinne wondered again why she had this dream and felt as if she always owed someone something and had to carry the whole burden herself. She thought about her subordinates who faced dangers not only in battles, and suddenly helplessness overwhelmed her again. But at that moment, Russ appeared and stood up for their defense. When the lives of her people were slipping through her fingers, it was he who rushed and saved them, and she considered it right and just. One good guy who burned with a thirst for discoveries just like her left the association as soon as she managed to reach him. His leaders turned out to be completely helpless. Since he now works for her, she decided to give him the freedom and support he always deserved. The next morning, Corinne asked Russ if he was already awake and where he was going. He stopped and noted that she always gets up at dawn, and she replied that for him it was rare. Russ sighed and said that in the last days there was little work, so he decided to gather materials, and Corinne agreed but asked him to be careful. She sincerely thanked him for helping her during her illness. As an admiral of the Dominion, she was ready to fulfill any of his requests. Russ was surprised why she said that. Corinne explained she just wanted to say that he can rely on his people. His habit of doing everything himself is both an advantage and a disadvantage at the same time. She added, probably he thinks that it is faster and easier this way, but one day he might get overworked, and others might not even notice it. Corinne asked Russ to trust his comrades, and firmly believed that they would not let him down. He smiled, and quietly said that she really had become a true leader. Russ nodded and replied that he understood everything, promised to let her take care of him. She laughed and said that she sincerely hoped so, and they set off together. At dawn her days began so that those long nights would at least become a little shorter. She smiled and reminded Russ that hard work awaited them today. Russ and Behemoth rushed through the forest, and the boy thought that he was finally returning after several days of traveling with this beast. Corinne gave him money so that he could solve the problem with the water reservoir. She handed him the money and admitted that she was not very good with calculations, and Russ thought that they had enough monster materials, so as soon as they got the water jugs they could get to work. With a smile, he added that on the way he managed to catch several monsters. Besides the one he was initially going for, good thing, he always kept scrolls ready for different cases. Russ knew that if a scroll was used on the wrong monster, the materials could spoil and lose their power. Ahead, he noticed a settlement and said to Behemoth with relief that they had almost reached the camp. Entering the village, he heard an explosion of joyful shouts. People sincerely greeted him and asked if everything was all right and how the hunt went. Russ waved his hand and felt true excitement from those loud greetings. Everyone was waiting for news about the increase of their water supplies. Lynn approached him, the one responsible for food, and joyfully exclaimed that Russ had finally returned. Russ thanked him and added that he would like to talk with him. Russ, with a slight sparkle in his eyes, explained to Lint that on the way back he hunted monsters and believes that their parts, unsuitable for alchemy, could be quite edible, so he brought them. He summarized that this could increase food supplies. Lint, surprised, asked if this was really so, and said he would gladly buy everything, and Russ clarified that he had already taken the necessary alchemical materials and processed the carcasses very little. Russ asked where to put it, and Lint briefly replied to take it to the tent where monsters are dissected. Russ went inside and immediately found himself surrounded by interested people. He awkwardly thought that everyone here was too curious. Lint directly asked where the meat of these monsters was, and Russ smiled and said he would get it now. Using magic, he pulled out monsters resembling huge bulls and, smiling, asked what they thought about it. Everyone immediately shouted that they wanted to buy them. People shouted, "These are 4 male two-horned beasts known for their danger and for attacking in packs." Lint noticed with surprise that the prey was in excellent condition. He called 2 assistants to come help, but Russ smiled and warned that this was not all and began pulling out other monsters. He explained 3-star rats are eaten cautiously, they have poison, but the meat is tasty. The 4-star hell horse with 3 heads is suitable for raw consumption within a day, and its skin is used for clothing. The 6-star mole bear is valued for organs used in medicine and fur for decorations. Lynch shouted in shock that this was too much. A bald man approached and listed 1,000 rats, hell horse, mole bear, and several other unknown species. He passionately declared that Russ had defeated at least several mole bears and hell horses, which were considered especially dangerous, and admitted that one day he would like to fight him. Russ awkwardly whispered that he leaves the rest to them, asked to be informed when the evaluation was finished, and hurriedly left to avoid a duel challenge. In his tent, he looked at Rosa and said, "I have returned." Russ sincerely thanked her for taking care of the lizard apparently. She diligently gave it the potion he left. He added that the creature's condition had not changed, but fortunately, it had not worsened. Supporting it was difficult because the same potions with magical elements used for humans could not be used. Russ thought even monsters can die from an excess of magical particles, and if the dose is too small, they simply go mad. He decided that constant monitoring was needed and entrusted Rosa after all. She is always meticulous in everything. Russ asked her not to slow down and left the tent. His gaze stopped at the water jugs. He noticed Roa, thanked her for the jugs, and praised them for their good appearance, and she only smiled and replied that there was nothing difficult about it. Russ ran his hand over the surface and happily noticed that there was not a single scratch, asked if any difficulties had arisen, and thought that thanks to their eye power such problems could be easily avoided. Roar admitted that there was tension in the capital, and some goods had become significantly more expensive. Russ was surprised. Had something really happened? He inquired about Karin as well. Roa replied that, of course, Mrs. Karin had been informed about everything, and Russ thought, since she is aware it means one can be calm. He loudly declared that all the ingredients were already ready. Now he would install the purification system, so everyone should step back. It would be just a transformation. Small tornado appeared. Russ said simply, just need to set the hardness of the diamond dust to maximum and now add crystal clear water. Magical energy was bursting out. While the water remained crystal clear, it obeyed the laws of physics again, raising entropy from zero. Dissolving the nearest particles, he added powder from a magic stone, lifted the bottle, and announced that the ink for writing magical diagrams was ready. Roa exclaimed, "This is incredible." Russ noticed her sincere interest, and with a quiet smile, explained that the next step was to free the water from gravity, because his goal was to complete the magical scheme. He touched the book and ordered to find the water purification scheme. The pages suddenly began to flip rapidly by themselves, and Russ immediately commanded to start decoding. He thought that with this solution he would draw the diagram directly on the surface of the jug, and loudly exclaimed, "Wonderful." Only the insertion of the magic crystal for power remained, and the work was complete. The young man smiled and said he would now repeat the same with another vase. Russ treated all the remaining jugs in the same way. Roa joyfully exclaimed that now they could use the water as much as they wanted, and Russ replied that this was only the beginning. Roa, surprised, asked what he meant. The young man explained that for now these were only vessels with water, but he aimed to create another magical item, thanks to which water would not have to be carried at all. The girl enthusiastically asked if he was really capable of that. Russ thought with slight embarrassment that she scared him a little, but confidently answered, "Of course," and Roa sincerely rejoiced and said she definitely wanted to see the result. Russ announced that it was time to set off. Feeling no threat, he went with Roa to the pond where the monster had lived before. He gently stroked the hippopotamus and asked him to inspect the body of water just in case. The monster joyfully plunged into the water. Russ explained that he would create a magical device to draw water from the pond. He installed a device made from the camp's durable waterproof material. The device was coated with a special compound that smelled of the poison of catfish tentaclesto scare off other monsters, and inside lay a magical stone of a rare creature. The hippopotamus jumped out of the water with a fish monster in its jaws. Russ smiled, petted it, and thanked it apparently. Now only such small creatures lived in the pond. Russ thought that after the catfish monster disappeared, the pond was quickly inhabited by other creatures. He adjusted the device and said that everything was working correctly. Roa asked what exactly he used the stone of a strange monster. Russ confirmed and added that they would have to set out to find this creature directly to the volcano. Roa asked what kind of monster it was, and Russ dryly replied a paralyzing cloud, and the girl exclaimed that it was a monster of a particularly dangerous rank, against which physical attacks do not work. Russ assured and explained that they would configure the system. It would notify as soon as the pond dried up, and the connection would be ready. He joyfully announced that now everything was ready, only the device needed to be turned on, and after activation, a strange magical object appeared. Roa asked what kind of artifact it was, and Russ smiled and replied that he had not yet invented a name, so for now he would call it the Cloud Water Distributor. He immersed the object in the water and clouds began to rise from it. Roa said in surprise that he was turning water into clouds and asked if he was heating it. Russ shook his head. No, that would be too expensive. The stone of the paralyzing cloud is responsible for the effect. He explained that this monster is a cloud with a mag-crystal body that literally rewrites the laws of physics. It turns water into clouds and holds them in the air, preventing them from dispersing. At first glance, he is an ordinary monster, but in reality his body is a magical crystal. Meanwhile, the clouds began to stretch towards the camp. Russ drew another magical circle on the jugs to make them the destination point. When the clouds reach them, the spell will dissipate and they will become water again. He said that actions speak louder than 1,000 words and suggested Roa try to disperse the clouds. The girl agreed and rushed to wave her spear. Russ noticed that invulnerability to attacks is a real advantage. In these parts, monsters could destroy any pipes, and driving them away along the entire length would be unrealistic. The girl was enchantedly gazing at the clouds, and Russ, making sure she was truly interested, approached the hippopotamus and reminded her that they needed to return to the camp as soon as possible. There are 3 main directions in alchemy. The first is to manipulate life itself, and its pinnacle is the transformation of beasts. The second is control over the magical element that gives life to potions. The third is the influence of the elements on life, which grows and explodes in the form of magical items. Alchemists who have mastered all these paths are considered those who walk the path of enlightenment. Russ and Roa returned to the camp and approached the jugs, and the young man said with a satisfied smile, "Wonderful, they are already full, so the task is completed." Ari approached them and called Russ. He asked what happened. The girl smiled and said she was glad of his return, but Lady Karin was calling him. Russ replied that he would go now. He entered Karin's tent. The girl handed him scrolls, apologized for the sudden summons, and said he needed to look at them. Russ took the message and immediately began reading. He noticed 2 parchments for communication before him, one already opened, the other still sealed. Karin smiled and said that he, as always, grasped everything instantly. She added that an ordinary alchemist would spend several days on vases and water purification, and Russ explained that he would still need time to draw magical diagrams, so the inspection could be postponed. The young man thought that the open letter was addressed to Karin. Usually he would have asked for permission, but she had given it herself, so there was nothing wrong if he familiarized himself, especially since he had already discussed the sale of crystals with the feudal lord. Karin replied that he had warned her, but she was still surprised. The young man said the terms looked favorable. The girl clarified even more, "They are incredible." She grabbed him by the collar and sharply pulled him towards herself, demanding to confess what trick he had used. Russ replied in surprise that she thought he had arranged something. The boy noticed that she was about to tear his clothes. Karin let go and apologized, and Russ adjusted his clothes and thought that with her strength he could have been left headless if she had pulled harder. Karin paused for a moment, then quietly said that it cost them almost nothing. Maybe there was a mistake somewhere. Russ understood. The neighboring feudal lord could offer to buy magical crystals, but by no means as profitably. He added that although the letter does not specify the exact type of crystals, it probably refers to old samples, and he firmly emphasized that there is no trickery here. The girl, gripped by horror, asked again if he meant H32. Russ smiled and confirmed that is exactly what he meant. Karin grabbed her head and exclaimed, "Of course, he is capable of that." She added that you won't find such people anywhere else. Russ clarified, "Does she mean the weapon or the crystal itself?" Karin replied, "No, most of the military are her subordinates, and they know their business well." Russ answered calmly this was exactly what was to be expected. Karin said that it no longer mattered, but it was obvious. The interests of the capital intersect here, so there will be a direct conflict. Boy smiled and confirmed more or less so. Karin added that he wasn't even bothered by the news, and only then realized she had said it out loud. Russ laughed quietly. She smoothed her hair and tiredly asked if he wanted her to do something about it. Russ replied that he had already asked Harold. The answer was in the second scroll. He threw the scroll to Karin, and she caught it easily, while the young man thought that Harold had been their mutual friend since the academy. Karin clarified that Harold works in the treasury, and now everything became clear. She carefully reviewed his letter, not wanting to miss any detail. Karin suddenly felt problems are really brewing in the capital. Ari and Roa had already told her about it, but she never even guessed it was so serious. She asked with a smile, "Isn't this a wonderful opportunity?" Russ replied that one must act quickly, just her word is enough, and he is ready. She laid the scroll on the table and said, "All right, now they will wait," and then added that she would give him more than he could bear. Russ smiled and accepted it. The girl smiled in response, sincerely rejoicing. The young man felt that this conversation seemed to take him back to his school years. The next day in the camp, Russ lay on the back of a hippopotamus under the open sky and enjoyed the light, pleasant breeze. He thought that today the trade of crystals with the neighboring dominion would start, so he himself stood by the entrance to the camp and waited for Ari and Roa. The boy decided, the sun here is so gentle that waiting is not scary at all. Suddenly Roa shouted, "They have already come, get up." Russ jumped off the hippopotamus and looked intently, trying to make out something. He thought that Roa was looking into the distance, but she herself saw nothing. Probably they would appear any moment now. The girl said to Russ, "I see everyone." She added that among them, there was someone incredibly strong. Russ squinted to see better. He thought that he fully entrusted the negotiations to Kareen because he himself did not know the details. He smiled and said that he saw. Kareen joked even before departure that with such trump cards, the negotiations would be boring, and Russ thought that he had already seen this contract, and the worst thing in it was the possibility of betrayal by the partner. The boy thought, I turned Kagero fruits into crystals and earn without limits, just warning about changes in production volumes for him. This seemed suspiciously profitable. The caravan drivers brought up the mules, and Russ understood logically. There are no roads in these parts, so carts would be powerless. It turns out that mules are the best transport here. He thought, to build the future, roads are needed first of all. Developing a remote region without resources requires decisions in politics and economics. Russ added, his boss Kareen is responsible for all this. The young man looked closely at the guests and was surprised some were wounded. Roa confirmed, probably someone attacked them. Russ noticed that the injuries were not that serious after all, so they had recovered. One of the travelers took off his hood, and the boy recognized Zar, the very one he had met on the way to Karin. Russ greeted him. Zar ran up, shining with joy, and exclaimed that before him was Master Russ himself. He was happy to take part in this deal. Russ smiled and quietly said, don't worry, they can speak just like before. Zar quietly apologized, saying it was not easy for him, but Russ, smiling, replied that he was glad to see them alive, even if some were wounded. He added that he could heal them if they agreed. Zar, amazed, exclaimed, this is incredible. Russ healed everyone with his elixir and explained that it was a universal potion he had recently prepared, so it should work well. The young man thought with relief that there were no serious wounds. The elixir was weak, but would help. Only people were hurt, not mules, though perhaps a few had to be left behind. Roa said that Master Russ should look ahead. The boy raised his head and saw the Holy Knight Talu. The girl blossomed into a wide smile and greeted him. Russ froze in surprise. He did not expect to see her here, in the middle of the delegation. Tala replied that she had come specifically to talk to him. Having accidentally found herself in Tomi, she learned about the caravan and asked to join, and the Tsar added that she had saved them from many troubles. Russ smiled and said he understood, and in his thoughts flashed. Fate brought him together immediately with two old friends. The Tsar approached the hippopotamus and exclaimed in surprise, what kind of creature is this? Russ turned to Tala and said that she was now in the borderlands. He had a feeling of the beginning of a new story. Russ asked how she was doing, and Tala sincerely replied that everything was fine thanks to him, and thanked him again for the rescue in the forest, and he responded that on the contrary she should be thanked for the protection on the road. Russ nodded and said that she was probably already tired, offered to rest a little, and then have a cup of tea together. He noticed there was something unspoken on her lips, but she was shy in front of others, so he asked if she wanted to come into his tent. Tala gratefully accepted the invitation. Russ called Roa. She asked confusedly what had happened, and he asked her to take the fruits of Jiro to the camp square. The girl nodded and promised to carry out the order. Tala entered Russ's tent and exclaimed with surprise that everything here was incredible, especially the furniture made of grapevines. Russ laughed and explained that the vines were thornless, so she could sit without fear. Placing 2 cups of tea on the table, he said he wanted to ask Lady Tala something. Tala interrupted him, looked straight, and said that she could be called simply Tala. He saved her life. She swore that her sword belonged to him, because she had only God whom she served, so formalities between them were unnecessary. Russ smiled and replied that then she should also call him simply Russ, but for now it was better to drink tea. While it was hot, the girl smiled and thanked him. Tala inhaled the aroma and said, this tea has an unusually rich scent. Russ thought that savoring rose tea and simply being together was a wonderful way to melt the ice. The girl looked at Russ and said she wanted to talk to him about the shaman. Russ asked if it was the same shaman who sent the familiar after her, and she confirmed. Tala explained that after his departure, the traces led her all the way to the capital. It was the shaman who destroyed her church, and because of the curse, he always knew where she was. But as soon as Russ lifted the curse, she immediately tracked him down and found the secret lair. Tears welled up in her eyes, her voice trembled with bitterness. The girl admitted that he still escaped. Tala handed him a magical diagram, and with a sly smile said she found it, there were many like it there. Russ asked if he could look at it, and instantly put on gloves that cleansed curses. He thought the artifact might be cursed, so he examined it carefully, then asked if Tala had shown it to the Great Alchemical Association. She answered no, she wanted to, but when she arrived there, she found a terrible mess. The walls had carelessly filled holes, a sharp stench hung in the air, and the workers walked like the dead. Russ guessed with horror that the slime was raging there, and did not believe it could have been left unattended. Tala quietly added that this thing could bring even more problems, so she left the rest to close friends and brought this one to him because she trusts him. This is a wise decision, said Russ. The girl loudly asked again, is that really so? He answered confidently, yes, this is a scheme that transforms magical elements into fire, created for war. He added that he had no doubt. This is the work of the Association Transmutation, is like their trademark. Tala said that there was also a lot of magical weaponry in the stash. She suspected that the association was connected with shamans. Russ confirmed it is suspicious. He explained, weapons that shoot magical elements are deadly to non-human creatures. Monsters simply die from magic oversaturation. This weapon could instantly take the life of even a human. That is why magical cannons seemed like simple tools for those without military training. Russ explained, element transformation always consumes part of the energy. This weapon was created for fighting monsters, but the scheme clearly served a completely different purpose. Tala interrupted him, so this weapon was prepared against people. Russ said exactly, but there is a problem. She immediately asked what exactly. He warned that while using it, the weapon could explode. This could harm everyone around. He emphasized, this does not look like a plan, rather a fatal defect. Tala shuddered. This is very bad, Russ confirmed. He looked at the diagram and thought that it was partially eaten by slime. He worked there and saw how irresponsibly everything was managed, and it annoyed him. Tala said that she did the right thing by entrusting him with everything, and thanked him. Russ replied that on the contrary, it was she who brought extremely valuable information. She added that she needed to meet with his boss, Mrs. Corrine, and asked to be taken there. Russ agreed and wanted to introduce them himself. Tala smiled, warmly praised the tea, and thanked him also for his wonderful transmuted monster, then went to attend to her affairs. Russ, smiling, stopped in front of the bags of fruits and said it was time to get back to work. R and others are leaving tomorrow, so Russ has to turn the Kagero fruits into magical crystals. He added that he must miss the festive guest meeting, but sees this as a great opportunity to finally get the job done at once. Russ picked up a berry and felt that such an opportunity must not be lost. He decisively said that it was time to start, and he would do everything possible. Next, the story is told from Tala's perspective. She sat in front of a plate covered with various and appetizing dishes. Suddenly she realized that she was at a dinner. Opposite her sat Lady Corrine, the ruler of these lands. On both sides sat her closest assistants. The food looked remarkably tasty, and Corrine addressed Tala to attract her attention. With a smile, Corrine said she was glad to welcome the Admiral to the Dominion. The world is small. Kindness always returns, and she recalled that Russ's acquaintance now guards their labors. Corrine emphasized that the dishes were prepared especially for her. Tala closed her eyes and thanked her, biting off a piece of meat. She recognized the meat of a bovine-like monster. It melted in her mouth, and the herbs in the sauce filled her head with a gentle aroma. The flavor passed through her whole body. The spices and meat juices were perfectly balanced. The magic in this meat pulsed incredibly surely. It was a trophy from a high-ranking monster. Tala noticed there was so much magic in the meat and asked Corrine what kind of two-horned beast it was, and the girl smiled and said she was a true gourmet. Corrine confirmed yes, it was a two-horned, adult female. Tala pressed her lips in astonishment. It is the females that are known to have the highest content of magical elements. Now it was completely clear why they were so strongly felt throughout the body. Ari added with a half-smile, this monster was hunted by Russ himself. Tala said her name and said that now it was clear his hunting skills equal those of an alchemist. Ari nodded and confirmed her words. Tala pondered. The air around seemed to have changed. The waitress placed a drink on the table and politely thanked her for waiting. Tala lifted the heavy mug, thought it was cold beer, and took a sip. The bitterness of fragrant hops washed away the juicy aftertaste of the meat from her mouth, giving coolness and a rich flavor. She set down the mug and said that the beer was wonderful. She did not expect to find such a drink in the lands of Ramat, and it pleasantly warmed her. She clearly understood. This was to be expected from the lands under Corin's rule, and with a barely noticeable smile, added that there were probably some advanced cooling devices here. Corin replied that overall all this was created by Mr. Russ. He often makes amazing things to improve the camp. Corin looked Tala straight in the eyes and whispered that she does it only for their sake. The girl thought she was just making excuses, but did not accuse her. Moreover, Corin asked what exactly Tala was doing in Russ's tent. Suddenly Tala realized she cares for a friend. Caring for comrades is something she herself lost after the attack. She added that, having lost all her friends, Corin still shone, and confessed that she was pursuing the shaman to avenge the death of her comrades. Tala admitted that she had come across a trail related to alchemy, so she turned specifically to Russ. Corin replied that this was exactly why she came to the borderlands, although there are many alchemists in the capital. Tala said she did not know anyone more gifted than Russ, and again, it was he who directed her path. She did not trust the capital's alchemists because they might be connected to the shaman. Corin smiled and agreed that Russ was indeed talented. Tala noticed that she looked happy, as if speaking about herself she simply radiated. With sadness, Tala admitted that she envied Corin once she too had many friends. Corin asked if the shaman was to blame, and the girl confirmed. Perhaps it was because of the wine, but Tala said that that evening, the moon shone extraordinarily brightly. Not yet having fully realized what had happened, Tala began to tell about the comrades whom the shaman had killed. 2 years ago, in the churches of the parish of Urli in Turnajalt, she heard someone calling her. Little Chia hugged the girl from behind. She handed Tala a doll and with a glow in her voice said that she had made it especially for her. Tala asked in surprise how she could repay her. Chia smiled and replied that no repayment was needed. The girl praised the work and asked if sewing came easily to her. Chia said that when she pricks her fingers, it hurts, but she still gave the doll and wanted to sew a dress for her. Tala smiled and said she understood. She was so kind that even the doll was happy. Chia asked if she was going to the city, and Tala replied that yes, she needed to buy necessary things. The girl then also asked for a nice bow for the doll. Tala sat down next to her, gently stroked her head, and promised that she would do so. Suddenly from behind, as if out of nowhere, another girl hugged her. Tala looked around and suddenly noticed Forte immediately asked if she was going shopping and asked her to bring cookies with mole bear meat. Forte added that she and Elle would wait. Tala showed a sign of agreement, and she thought that their church stood in the forest outside the city, so the road for shopping was always long. That day it was her turn. There were many things to buy. She was already about to leave earlier, but suddenly heard the call of the abbess Lady Sala, Abbas Sala Menning. Tala said she was going to the city, and Sala advised her to first go there, and only then to the forest. The girl explained that medicinal herbs were still needed, and the trip to the city was just a good opportunity to buy them. Sala asked if they would have too large expenses on medicine. She added that she should be careful during training injuries, when a loan can be costly. Tala thought that Lady Sala was like a mother to her wise, compassionate, and beloved by all. Sala, with a tremor in her voice, asked the goddess Arilu to protect her. Tala asked Corin if she knows the three faces of the goddess Erasli. She answered, yes, love. Tala stubbornly denied Ither is both wisdom and revenge. Because she had strength, she learned two paths at Onselov and revenge, which is why the training lasted longer, and that day she returned only at night, just when the shaman attacked. Tala was walking through the forest thinking it was already too late, but she smiled. She had a cubo and rare ingredients, and she believed she would be forgiven. She was already expecting another reproach from Lady Sala, but suddenly a bright light flashed over the hill. Startled, she rushed to the church. Stopping, Tala froze in horror. The entire church was ablaze. She threw down her bag and rushed inside. Before her lay Chia, her little dog, beside her. Tala thought bitterly that she had been so afraid of pain, and now she was dead. Nearby lay her doll, like an old rag. Her gaze fell on the main hall. It blazed the most fiercely, and she instantly realized that the fire had started there. The doors were locked from the outside, and through the broken window tongues of flame illuminated silhouettes moving inside, as if trapped. Tala screamed, calling someone for help. She said to Corinne with regret that she could do nothing. Suddenly the fire seemed to subside, and she saw the body of Mother Superior Sala. It was terribly burned, but the facial features were still recognizable. The smile did not fade even after death, but as soon as one touched it, the shaman's trap was triggered. A mark of the curse suddenly appeared on the body, and the shaman desecrated her death, turning the body into a source of corruption that devoured everyone nearby. Tala said she would never forgive their death. He played with Lady Sala herself, and the bruises from the curse became a mark of shame he inflicted on her. The girl began to cry and whispered that she was very sorry. They were supposed to live, not her. She was the one who was supposed to die. Corinne approached, took her hand, and quietly whispered that she was sorry that she had to endure such pain again. Tala wiped her tears and quietly replied that she had to say it. She was growing up, after all, since the curse was lifted. She would raise her sword again, and it would shine as soon as she took revenge. Corinne agreed and said they would wait for that day. Tears welled up again in Tala's eyes. Sincerely thanking Corinne, she addressed her by name for the first time, just as Rast did. Meanwhile, Rast was working with crystals, wearily noting that he had already done a lot, and after hours of transmutation, he was overcome by a strong thirst. Ari approached him with a tray, placed it in front of him, and offered him to rest. She had brought food and drink. Rast, a little surprised, thanked her. Indeed, he was very thirsty. He took the food from the girl's hands and began to eat standing up. Ari smiled. Their tents were very close, and she offered to bring a chair. She instantly returned with 2 chairs, one for him and one for herself. Rast awkwardly apologized for the trouble, but the girl waved it off, saying it was nothing, and and he raised the mug of ale and greedily took a sip. After long hours of work, the cold drink refreshed his throat, and he thought, here it is true salvation. Ari explained that Lind had recently brewed this ale for the holiday in honor of the guests. She added that he was very proud of his work and had experimented for a long time to perfect the taste. Rast smiled and agreed. The drink was truly wonderful, with an amazing aroma, and he guessed that they probably used ingredients from plant monsters. The young man asked in surprise whether Lind dealt not only with food, but also with drinks. Ari just smiled and confirmed that he even went hunting for a barley monster. Rast looked at the dish before him lay a two-horned steak, and although he had encountered such before, this was the first time it was so juicy and fatty. He admitted that the local cuisine was a real wonder, the same products, but different tastes every time. Ari replied that for them it was the only consolation. Then the girl, gathering courage, quietly whispered that she wanted to talk to him alone. Rast put down the spoon, looked up, and asked, about what exactly? Ari said that he had already noticed their special abilities with her sister, and Rast just nodded. He understood this back when they set up the ambush. He added that it seems Roa can see incredibly far and sense the power of people or monsters. Ari smiled. He almost guessed right. Roa really can see far, sense power, and a little look into the future. Rast froze in surprise. This is incredible. Magical eyes are rare, and here are two at once with the gift of prophecy. He thought such things only happened in legends. Ari explained, her gift is weak. She only sees probable collisions, and maybe a few seconds ahead, no more. Rast objected that it was still amazing, and asked if that meant she had already studied his fighting style. Ari looked at him and remained silent. Although her face was covered with cloth, Rast effortlessly imagined a smile beneath it. He hastily changed the subject and asked to forget the question. He was more interested in what she was confident about. He recalled she had already told him about her magical eyes and how to activate them. Ari replied that she decided to trust him because for her family is both a secret and those who risk their lives for the development of these lands. He helped them a lot, so she decided to tell the truth because she believes him. Rast nodded and said he understood. Let her continue. The girl touched the mask and confessed that she wanted to tell him the truth. Rast felt the reaction of the magical elements and whispered that it was a seal, a restricting artifact. Ari confirmed confidently. Yes, he understood everything correctly. These are unique magical items. There are only 2 in the world. She threw it, hinting that he could guess for what they were made. Rast just smiled at a guest, nothing special. He asked if they wanted him to fix them, but Ari just shook her head. She explained that these masks were created to restrain their powers, which sometimes get out of control, but the artifacts are weakening. Rust was caught by surprise. If masks lose power, it means their abilities grow. He paused for a moment and quietly said that he could create new seals, but it would take time. Ari, shining with excitement, asked again, really? She fell to her knees, sincerely thanked him, and swore that she would not remain in debt. Rast raised his hand and asked her to stand up. He almost whispered, recalling her words. She had already said they are a family who risked their lives together for the development of these lands. He smiled. Now Roa and they had become his family, and he would help them all as much as he could. Thanking for the food, he said it was time to get back to work. Tomorrow he would take a closer look at their abilities. Ari gladly agreed and bowed to him, and he again took the magical crystals in his hands. The next morning the Tsar looked at the mountain of crystals with surprise. Could he really have managed to do it all in one night? Rast awkwardly asked if they would even be able to transport it all. In the excitement, the Tsar ordered his men to harness the mules and assured that everything would be done. He added that the elder spoke about Rasta's great talents and now he has exceeded all expectations. Rast smiled, but the Tsar, inspired, decisively said that he must call an influential person. Rast tried to refuse, but he was not listened to. Soon he and Korin found themselves in a tent before an important person. The man introduced himself. Mamos, an official from the Dominion of Dabbleton. Rust even jumped up when he realized that he himself was overseeing the deal. Mamos admitted that he was stunned. He did not expect that overnight a whole mountain of Kagero fruits would turn into crystals. He added, now it is time to discuss the reward. After thinking for a moment that the elder had probably already told the feudal lord about his abilities, they prepared the payment in advance. He glanced at Mamos. He was jotting something down with an artifact pen that protected documents from forgery. His gaze stopped on the seal that the servant of Mamos brought. He felt she too is a magical artifact. Running his eyes over the letter, Rast smiled. The amount there is more than twice the annual budget of the basic research department. Korin said with a light, satisfied smile, wonderful, now they can consider the account balanced, and she ordered the assistant to pay Rast's share according to the contract. She stood up and with a sparkle in her voice solemnly declared, From now on, an alchemical research department is being established in this dominion under her leadership, and Rast is its head. Rast, stunned, knelt down and placed his hand on his heart. He thought this was truly an official decision, but he was already used to her unexpected actions and had to express gratitude. Corin loudly confirmed, as if delivering a verdict. She declares this on behalf of the ruler of the Dominion, Admiral Corin. The profit from the sale of crystals will temporarily replenish the department's budget, deducting Rast's share. The scribe who was noting her words almost got confused by such a decision. Rast thought that creating a department was no easy task, and dealing with paperwork was pure torment. Corin smiled and addressed Mamos. As agreed, the crystals will be delivered to their destination, even to his holdings. Now he will take care of the details himself and can hardly wait to use this strategic resource. Rast was sure that Corin's talent shone brightest in planning, so it was easier to entrust everything to her. Corin summed up the meeting, saying that he still needed to stay a little longer. He guessed it would be about the new department, but suddenly Tala appeared, greeted him with a smile, and sincerely congratulated him on the appointment. Rast replied embarrassedly that everything happened unexpectedly, and he still did not know how to feel about it. The girl said she would like to see him in action, but had to use the information about the shaman that he had given her. Tala smiled and said goodbye, sincerely hoping that everything would be fine for him. Rast watched her leave and thought she will definitely take revenge on the shaman for what was done. Turning to Corinne, he heard her point to the document these were his new duties, and she was counting on him. Rast replied that he would do everything. He thought that his work would hardly change, and suddenly it felt pleasant. He could continue engaging in fundamental research. Corinne added, the reports must indicate how much, and on what he spent expenses on his own ideas were also allowed, but only within reason. She moved toward the exit, but suddenly froze. The department needed to be gradually expanded so that it would become a full-fledged, independent organization. She ordered, think about the name. Rast pondered her words. When Corinne left, he glanced at the table with books and equipment. He thought that the name should not evoke associations with alchemy. After all, the new department was still subordinate to the state. Perhaps the name should reflect the character of the Admiral's dominion. But he was not going to invent something on the fly. He summoned a scroll and decided to focus on current matters. Two figures appeared in front of his tent, Ari and Roa. They politely asked for permission to enter. The girls came in. Rast smiled and said he wanted to examine them, as Ari had once mentioned, and she thanked him for that. He knew they understood that he was busy. Rast noticed that Roa had already previously scrutinized the tent, probably using magical sight. Rast asked Rosa to create 2 chairs for the sisters. They appeared immediately and made the girls sit down. He also sat down and announced that he would begin studying the flow of magical elements in their eyes and in the tissues that restrain them. Ari agreed. Roa also said, all right. Rast explained that he would place a protective scroll over what was already there and meanwhile study their magical fabric. Roa asked who would go first. He felt their Furthy would have to remove the artifact they had worn all their lives, but he smiled and decided to start with Roa, because Ari's abilities exhausted the body more. Ari gently assured him everything would be fine, so he should not worry. Roa said confidently that they fully trusted him. Rast extended a small scroll and sternly ordered to wrap Roa's head with it so that it covered her eyes. Ari stared at the scroll for a long time, then quietly approached her sister and carefully replaced the bandage with the scroll. She reported that it was ready. Rast nodded and began carefully reading the magical information from the girl. After finishing, he asked Roa how she felt, and she anxiously whispered that she could see absolutely nothing. Rast smiled. That meant the scroll was working. He gently adjusted her hair and asked Ari to remove the artifact. It was safe now. Ari carefully removed the bandage from her sister's face. Rast and she froze. It was extremely strange to see Roa without the mask. Roa began to cry and whispered to Ari that she did not need sight. Everything seemed so strange. Rast was confused, not knowing how to properly understand her feelings. Ari rushed to her sister, hugged her tightly, and gently stroked her head. Roa buried her face in her stomach from a strange weakness, and Ari quietly whispered that everything was all right. Rast smiled and without hesitation decided to immediately examine the Roa artifact to better understand its nature. He called Rosa and asked her to bring the magic elements tester. The Rose pulled it from the branches and handed it to the master. Rast thanked her and immediately began preparations. He explained that the tester emits weak, almost human waves to check artifacts and energy flows. Surprisingly, the stone was silent. Rast placed his hand on the bandage and suddenly felt the source of magic pulsing in the fabricite where it touched the bridge of the nose. He pulled out the pendulum and, as if returning to those days of studying the disease, brought it to the mask to determine the energy fluctuations. The pendulum froze near the bridge of the nose, and Rast instantly understood. the artifact was simply a reservoir of energy, an amplifier, and a noise suppressor. But he froze in thought whether such a decision was appropriate, since there are many ways to rebuild this mechanism. He noticed, although the construction was troublesome, the very idea of an internal energy flow was successfully embodied. He carefully examined the fabric once again. Seeing the symbol, Rast thought that the master who created these artifacts did not reach beyond the second level. He himself could easily have made something better. But still, these artifacts were clearly created by a person who sincerely cared about Ari and Roa, and he hesitated whether to tell the girls about it. Glancing at the sisters, Rast saw how Ari tilted Roa's head toward herself and supported her. Roa felt safe. Rast felt that Roa had already calmed down. The psychological factor turned out to be no less important than the artifact itself. He decided that the feeling of security worked better than any magic. Smiling, he handed Roa the fabric and asked for permission to examine it once more. He ordered Ari to return the artifact to her sister's face and loudly pronounced the spell to dispel the seal. Roa's face lit up, and her hair slightly lifted from the energy. Rast wrapped the scroll again, approached, and asked Roa to extend her hand. She offered it with a trembling chest, not understanding what he intended. He proclaimed the activation of the transfer protocol, governing body scroll, target Roa means sealed scroll, and completed the ritual. Roa felt the scroll in her hands and did not immediately understand its purpose. Rast smiled and explained that he had several like it, and this one could stay with her. He added that he had taught her how to use it. She could apply the scroll whenever she wanted to rest and recharge her strength. Roa raised her head and immediately bowed it down again. Rast froze in surprise. Something was displeasing her. She trembled, overwhelmed with emotions, and quietly whispered words of sincere gratitude. Rast heard them, though the voice was barely audible. Ari smiled under her mask and approached to comfort her sister. The sisters shone with joy. Although Roa could not hold back tears, she was filled with happiness she had not expected, and Rast looked at them with a warm smile. Sitting down at the table, he stared at the two masks. They looked like ordinary pieces of fabric. It was hard to believe that magic could be hidden in them. He finished the research and immediately began inventing new artifacts for the sisters. On his table lay stacks of books that had opened his eyes to the problem of Ari and Roa. He passionately wanted to help, but hesitated whether to give them the new items. These objects were more powerful, but during the analysis Rast felt that they were created by someone very close to the girls. Would it be right to deprive them of this connection? He clearly felt, to accept the new artifacts, the girls had to give up the old ones. Their powers were too unique to risk. They are incredibly rare. Very little is known about them yet, and the psychological factor plays an extremely important role in controlling these powers. Rast said if it were only about controlling their power, the old artifacts could be easily improved. The new masks looked simpler. He realized that the matter was not easy. One could create a device to measure the level of control and compare artifacts. Taking a pen, he strained to concentrate. The boy loudly admitted that his research seemed to have hit a dead end. Chasing enemies, strange tasks, and a meager budget pressed on him from all sides. But now he had money, and he could try a different approach. He thoughtfully looked at the masks. Yes, a completely different path is needed, not just to enhance the indicators, but to make it so that the power could be completely turned off and on, adding automatic control. Rast sharply grabbed a sheet and began rapidly drawing new diagrams. He muttered that if he unfolded the form and added what was needed, everything would work out, so he worked on the drawing all night without stopping. In the morning, Ari and Roa entered. His tent, smiled, and said he had prepared new artifacts for them. The sisters ran to the table, beaming with excitement. Their gazes stopped on the glasses and monocle, simple, unadorned, just as they were supposed to be, so as not to attract attention. The girls took them in their hands, holding their breath from unfamiliar things. Ari asked what to do with them and how to use them. Rast explained that the thin metal brackets needed to be spread apart. Ari did exactly that. He confirmed that everything was correct, and now only fitting remained. At his request, the sisters removed the bandages and put on new artifacts. For the first time they could walk without bandages. Roa carefully tried on the glasses and suddenly exclaimed in surprise. Ari smiled, repeating her sister's movement, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The sisters looked at each other, and Roa happily exclaimed that Ari's face was so beautiful, and Ari smiled in response, feeling a strange renewal. Rast said that it suits them very well. He was satisfied with the result. Ari added that she really likes it, even if she is not used to it yet. Next to the pond, Rast began to explain how to use the artifacts. First, they took Roa. She raised her spear and with one strike struck the monsters swarming in the water. Rast carefully watched and asked if everything was working well, if there were any shortcomings. Roa confidently replied that she was satisfied. Touching the goggles, she activated the enhancement mode and immediately caught an armored salmon with tough scales. Its roe is a real delicacy, so she decided to test the artifact further. Rast grimly noted that such salmon swam upstream after the disappearance of the giant catfish. He coldly said that even Kareen couldn't pierce such armor with a single strike. Roa just smiled in response and said that the gaps between the scales were impressive. He stepped aside, pondering whether to use these materials in his affairs. Suddenly, Roa ran up to him. She assured that everything was fine with the artifact. Rast clarified whether there would be problems when switching modes or slipping during battle. Roa shook her head in denial, and Ari reproachfully told her sister to be more polite. Rast helped them, so they should respond courteously. Roa lowered her eyes and said that now she could fully control the magical eyes. The world had become clear and distinct for her. Rast listened intently, straining to catch every word. Roa calmly explained that switching between transparency and long-distance vision modes happens smoothly. She added that voice control is convenient, but in battle, it is nicer and more reliable to switch manually, and Rast agreed that physical control in combat is better. Roa said she holds the spear in her right hand and wants to control the artifact with her left. Rast extended his hand and asked to hand over the goggles for reworking. He unrolled the scroll and sharply ordered to rewrite the scheme, transfer all functions from the right side to the left. He adjusted the goggles and said everything was ready. Roa joyfully tried them on again and rushed to the pond to test on new monsters. Ari looked at her sister with a sincere smile and said that she was so happy. She grabbed her monocle and jabbed the spear forward, then apologized to Rast for the trouble. Suddenly a salmon jumped out of the pond and impaled itself on Ari's spear. Rast was even surprised, thinking that the fish deliberately aimed at her weapon. Could it be so? He immediately understood no, the matter was different. Ari predicted his move thanks to the eye that sees the future, and the girl smiled happily. Rast looked at her and thought, they really are sisters with Roa, she is so joyful, but Ari looked at him attentively and pretended to be offended. The boy was embarrassed. It turns out her eye works not only in battle. She even sees his thoughts, which he involuntarily voiced, and when Ari answered, no, Rast thought with shock that she was reading his mind. The girl laughed and said that he was not entirely wrong. Her face suddenly became unusually soft and pretty. Meanwhile, the action shifts to Lee Halesome. In the huge building of the association, he was at a reception with the head, and furious, hotly asked why anyone would even think about Rast's return. This must not be done. Halesome was boiling with anger. He had barely gotten rid of a persistent rival, and again there was talk about him. His life had just begun to improve, so he slammed his head on the table and ordered to look at the reports. Every day the Parliament sends the same thing: exhausted apologies for transmutation failures due to poor quality materials, reports on deadline failures due to supply delays, and endless demands for compensation. The head sharply turned in his chair and said that complaints were pouring in from all branch managers. They demand respect for agreements, and he simply does nothing. He sharply reminded Halesome of his own words. Supposedly, without Rast nothing would change, and now how to explain the current chaos. Halesome was embarrassed, lowered his head, but the head suddenly slammed the table and shouted that he not only failed to replace Rast, but also harmed the entire association. He pointed to the holy walls, boarded up with any old planks, and to the smell of slime that still hung in the air. The whole building looked miserable. Lee Halesome bowed his head even deeper. He had no words. Gathering himself, he muttered that he was still against Rast's return. His fist trembled with anger. He didn't even mention that after Rast left, their sales shot up to a record. Halesome added that new crystals had appeared, but the chief sharply interrupted him, saying he already knew that. The chief coldly reminded him that this was exactly why he entrusted him to take Rast's place, to fill the void. If he failed, he would personally make him beg for the rival's return. Lee Halesome suppressed his anger and replied that he understood, but in his thoughts he cursed Rast again and swore never to forgive him. In fury, he opened the door to the weapon alchemy department, and before him opened truly ravaged halls, just as the chief had said. The workers glanced at him and pretended not to notice anything. Everyone continued working as if nothing had happened. Halesome sat down at the old table. A couple of books did not save the scene. The department looked abandoned. Sabas ran in, shouting that they had big problems. The master irritably asked why he was in such a hurry. The boy reported that most of the new crystals had been returned. Lee Halesome froze in surprise. He roared that this was some kind of mistake, and Sabas pointed to a pyramid of boxes and said, "Look for yourself." The master was stunned. Before him was a mountain of boxes returned because of traces of foul slime, and there were an incredible number of them. He thundered, sharply asking if Sabas did not understand that this was paid merchandise, and he only shrugged. He himself did not know what had happened. Halesome shouted sharply to immediately contact the wholesalers. Torjak approached him hesitantly. The master sharply asked what he knew. He timidly replied that nothing had happened today. Halsum fiercely asked what to do with this mess. Tordek timidly noted that you can't just throw everything away, to which he shouted heatedly, "Of course not, this is the main source of income for the association." He sharply ordered everyone to head to the storages, throw out the old, free up space, and put these new crystals there, and then he would figure out where to send them. One of the employees timidly asked what to do next, and heard in response a cold verdict: "There is no way out, everything will have to be sent to the nearest warehouse." The girl, eyes wide with surprise, asked if they were really being forced to throw things away just because they looked old, and the boy replied, "Yes, the warehouses are also subordinate to the weapons alchemy department." Someone added that if they cleaned well, everything would fit. They entered a room with large cabinets filled with various things. There was dirt and dust, but it was unlikely that these were truly useless association items. Skinny asked with interest if they were really going to throw away those old wooden boxes. She glanced at the shelf and pointed to one of the numerous boxes. She asked what was inside, and was told that the label had worn off so much that nothing could be made out. The girl picked it up, smiled, and said that these were just remnants of the fallen Department of Elementary Research. She added that if it were important, it wouldn't be covered with such a thick layer of dust. She approached another cabinet and, somewhat interested, quietly asked what was stored there. Skinny took a bottle with liquid from her, shook it, and said that it was a transparent, colorless liquid. Tordek brought a pendulum to her, carefully tracked the reaction to magical elements, and added that since it was colorless and transparent, it was probably a defective potion. Skinny laughed and said that even such trash was kept. Apparently, things were going very badly in that department, and she asked if it was possible to just throw it all away. One of the employees hesitantly suggested first consulting with Master Lahalsum, but Tordek wearily replied, "No need." He imagined how Lahalsum would start yelling again that nothing could be done without his instructions, and decided to avoid that, so he ordered Skinny to pour everything into the river. Meanwhile, they would engage in moving the boxes, and only then start assembling new magical crystals. There was plenty of work ahead. Skinny agreed, but first decided to close the box. On the back of the lid, her eyes fell on the inscription, "Concentrated solution of magical elements. Use with extreme caution." It was exactly such a solution that Rast often used when he was just beginning his elemental research. Skinny shouted that she would take the box to the river with the help of a transmuted beast. She began pouring the liquid into the water. For humans, magical elements were not dangerous, so it seemed that nothing terrible would happen, but there was also a downside. Because there were no immediate consequences, no one would notice the mistakes of Tordek and others. Until it was too late, the fish splashed happily in the river, but very soon their habitat would change. Now everyone gathered in the communication hall of the Alchemists Association. Many magical devices were set up there. Sabas grabbed the report in his hands and exclaimed in shock that he could not believe it. Reading was difficult. The news turned out to be very alarming. Lahalsum burst into the office and angrily asked what was going on here. The boy looked at the master with fear, and this irritated him even more. Lahalsum shouted to be given the report immediately. Not waiting for a reaction, he lost patience and snatched the sheet from the assistant's hands. He was unbearably eager to find out what was written there. His eyes raced over the lines of text, and his face grew gloomier with each line. He looked up at Sabas, who only nodded a silent confirmation. Everything written in the report was true. Lahalsum muttered in complete shock that old model crystals had entered the market, and there were incredibly many of them. This was simply impossible. He shouted that he did not believe it. Such a thing simply could not be. The master muttered and shuddered. Imports had long been blocked, so only smuggling remained, but their quantity was too large. Could someone be producing them here? That was unreal. He exploded again, shouting that if there were an alchemist in the association capable of such a thing, he would be immediately expelled. Unlicensed masters of that level simply did not exist. Suddenly his thoughts were interrupted. He remembered that Rast had left the association. His heart clenched in his chest. "It's definitely him," thought Halsum, almost in tears, and lowered his eyes. Sabas quietly noted that their new model crystals were meanwhile being returned en masse. If this continued, they would be left with mountains of unsold goods. The shouts made the people in the room turn around. Someone angrily whispered that it was complete chaos here. Lahalsum thundered, asking about sales, and Sabas replied that they had managed to somewhat fix the situation. The boy whispered that they were deeply in the red. The man looked at Sabas in horror. Lahalsum, shocked, asked again if they were really in debt now, shouted that it could not be, refused to believe, and repeated that such a thing was impossible. Anger rose in him. He would have to swallow his pride and ask Rast to return, but that was the last thing he wanted, so he shouted that he would never do it. He even felt disgusted at the very thought of meeting Rast, and even more so at the request to help. At that moment, a young man entered the room and called Master Lahalsum. He turned around to hear what they wanted from him. The young man reported that the chief was calling him and looked very angry, and Lee Halsum cleared his throat. Frightened, he sharply ordered Sabas to come up with something. Sabas replied in surprise that he was just a simple worker and could do nothing. Sabas sighed and said that probably nothing could help here. Lahalsam shouted loudly across the entire association. He has big problems and does not know what to do. In his head, only one voice echoed again and again, Rast. And at that very moment, the boy sneezed loudly because Lee Halsum was constantly thinking about him. Lahalsam was walking together with others across the clearing that led into the forest. That day there was unbearable heat. The legs barely Obietsi were barely moving. The man could not believe he was in such a situation, but it was an order. Memory surged. He entered the head's office, and the latter declared that he himself must return. Rasta. Lee Halsum froze in surprise, looking at the chief. He could not believe what he heard. The head spoke heavily that he was obliged to take responsibility for everything that had happened, and Lee Halsum clenched his fists but remained silent. So he ended up in the forest, angrily thought that he even paid the guards out of his own pocket, and looking at the people with contempt, decided that they were just a bunch of losers who didn't even know how to fight properly, but at least something. One of the guys called Lee Halsum and said he wanted to ask something. Lee grumbled irritably, "What do you want?" And the guy asked uncertainly if they were definitely going the right way, because around there were only thickets and it was dangerous to move here. Lee Halsum glanced at the path, said uncertainly that probably yes, then barked at the people not to fill their heads with nonsense, and asked if they understood what they had to do. He handed them weapons for self-defense, explaining that magical cycles were hidden in them that changed the element. He made these samples himself. One of the guys smirked slyly and promised to do everything as Sir Lee Halsum said, and then they even joked that they would shoot Rastus right in the back and roast him to a crispy crust. Lee Halsum ordered to listen carefully. First they need to lure him out and only then kill him. After that, they should bring the monsters so they eat the body. He added that Rastus must have a lot of money because he makes crystals of the old model. Two brothers exchanged glances and smiled fiercely. Lee Halsum promised to divide everything equally and strictly ordered silence. The brothers assured him that they could be relied on. One of them boldly said that some bookish weakling would not cause them any problems, and Lee Halsum went after them so as not to stay alone in the forest. He hissed through his teeth. His companions were real losers. The heat pressed like in a steam room, and Rastus was to blame for everything because of him. They had to push into this dangerous wilderness full of monsters. Remembering the words of the leader, he shouted that this president was disgusting too. He only thinks about his own reputation. Promised to increase funding if Rastus returned, saying that then he would run back with tears in his eyes. Suddenly a small monster jumped out and growled at Lee Halsum. He jumped back in panic and shouted, calling Eden for help. Eden approached and asked what had happened, and seeing the creature, shrugged slightly and said it was just a minor monster and nothing terrible. Eden ordered the brothers to deal with it, and one of them took out a weapon and decisively declared that he would settle everything now. He approached the small monster and killed it with one shot. He laughed and boasted that it was too easy. Eden smiled and assured that with this weapon nothing threatened them, now everything would be fine. But suddenly other monsters crawled out from under the rocks. Eden smiled and said the next one would be his, reminding that many creatures in this region react to sound. Eden shouted to his friends to look ahead. The monsters were coming at them themselves, as if deliberately exposing themselves to the shots. He thought confusedly that there were too many of them, and one of the brothers asked fearfully if there were too many here. Eden growled for them to shoot the monsters faster. Lee Halsum stood behind and sharply shouted, "Stop, we need to replace the magical schemes, because changing the elements quickly exhausts energy." Eden screamed in horror that they kept coming and coming, began shooting non-stop, but not all bullets hit. Suddenly there was a misfire and he panicked and roared, "Why did the weapon fail?" The men panicked. The monsters were increasing in number, so they rushed to act in complete chaos. Rast had warned earlier the new type of weapon often fails. Eden shouted even louder that there were more and more of them, and ordered the brothers to shoot the last ones. One of the brothers replied that he had already tried several times, but nothing happened. He shouted in despair that the magical elements were finished. All together shouted at Lee Halsum, "The crystals are finished," and someone's weapon also broke. They demanded spare crystals for the guns. Lee Halsum shouted sharply that he had no spare crystals. The guys looked at him in horror. They couldn't believe the master hadn't taken them with him. Glancing at their cannons, they suddenly fled from the monsters, and Lee Halsum shouted fiercely after them, "Stop immediately, where are you running?" He looked at the monsters that had already come right up to his feet. Lee Halsum screamed wildly. Now he would have to fight them off himself. He unrolled the scroll and loudly shouted the activation command. Light flashed around him. The space seemed to have grown into his body, and the path merged with his flesh. His combat transmutation is a parasitic beast, the first destroyer. Lee Halsum grimaced in Painhai's hand, began to turn into viscous slime from which dozens of mushrooms grew. He roared that these miserable insects would now feel true wrath. 30 years ago, Lee Halsum was an attractive yet gloomy man. For some reason, all his combat transmutations always became parasitic fungi that merged with his body. It was terrible, but he had no other way to attack. Because of this, he fiercely hated battles. He had to release fungal spores that infected monsters and knocked them to the ground. Monsters writhed, fell, and died, and mushrooms grew from their bodies. They could not fight, their bodies were rotting from the inside. Lee Halsum glanced over the clearing. It was completely covered with parasitic mushrooms, but the monsters kept coming wave after wave, replacing the dead. He struck again with his hand, shouting for them to perish, and crushed the monsters one after another, exclaiming that they would all die one by one. Then a monster crawled up from behind. The man did not notice it, lifted his leg to finish off another, and suddenly felt a bite on his thigh. Lee Halsum grabbed his leg and howled in pain. The monster clung tightly to his body and would not let go, trying with all its might to inflict as much damage as possible, while the man looked at it in horror, feeling it tear his flesh. Gathering his strength, he kicked it with all his might. The creature flew away, already dead. Lee Halsum looked at the torn clothes through which the wound was visible. The monster had indeed inflicted serious damage, and he thought painfully that the potion should help. He dealt the final blow to the monsters, looked around to make sure no one was left, and whispered with relief, "It seems this is the end." His hands slowly regained human features, and he groaned in pain until the transmutation was complete. He shouted, blaming the cursed Rast for everything, but his words were lost, was alone in the middle of the forest. Lee Halsum uncorked the potion and drank greedily, wiped his face. Exhausted after the battle, he said with burning hatred that when he met Rast would kill him, even if formally he returned to the association. He took a step and screamed. The injured leg burned unbearably. He knew he had to keep going, no matter how hard it was. Lee Halsum limped along the path, repeating with fury that Rast would pay for everything. Meanwhile, Rast approached the hippopotamus, smiling, and said it was time to set off. Today he was going to deal with one of the main tasks of an alchemist's development of lands, and in the distance, silhouettes of tents were already visible. The boy explained that the soil needed to be cleared of magical elements, otherwise the grain would not sprout there. These elements disperse energy in the atmosphere, and only then can farmers cultivate the land. Rast dug a small hole and thought that he would have to make them all over the field in the carefully plowed stone-free soil, each hole just the right size to fit his hands. The boy remarked aloud that the soil was somewhat hard, but he would manage. The hippopotamus gently nudged him. Rast looked at the beast in surprise. He asked if it wanted to help. The boy pointed to the place where they needed to dig. The hippopotamus joyfully growled and quickly dug a hole with its paw. Rast was delighted and praised it. The beast dug several more times until Rast stopped it and thanked it for the help. The hippopotamus looked at its master with curiosity, waiting to see what would happen next. Rast took an onion bulb from his pocket and said, "Now we need to plant these transmuted tubers so that they extract excess elements from the soil." He slowly inserted the bulb into the hole. The hippopotamus became sad and sighed deeply. Rast laughed, patted it, and said he understood this was too difficult a task for the beast, but it had helped a lot anyway. The boy unrolled a scroll, smiled, and proclaimed that there should be no leaks, after which he instantly started collecting magical elements. A magical sign flared above the scroll. The same symbols shone above all the holes with bulbs, and Rast joyfully said that everything was going wonderfully. He touched the scroll, which sparkled with energy. He said everything was fine, only the excess elements needed to be pumped out. Suddenly, the bracelet on his wrist slipped off. The boy looked at it in surprise, returning from checking the artifacts. It was Roa who gave him this bracelet and said it was their talisman from their homeland. Rast smiled and asked if she had really woven it with her own hands. Roa lowered her eyes, blushed, and quietly nodded. She added that if ever needed, it could be cut. Rast looked at the bracelet again and thought that he was incredibly lucky to receive it from Roa, but could something so easily broken really be called an amulet? He leaned on the hippopotamus, raised his hand with the bracelet, and quietly said that the process would take a long time, so he would reread the records of his predecessor. Rast took out a scroll with notes and said, "Here it is." It was a study comparing the concentration of magical elements in the soil and their effect on millet. Before leaving, he gathered all the materials from the basic research department and stuffed them into this scroll. Rast said he knew for sure Lee Halsum would have thrown this trash away, but something really interesting was recorded here. He thought that if a little magical particles were left in the soil, the food would seem tastier. It's a trick for the brain. The illusion enhances the sense of taste. The product itself does not change. This study concerned how magical elements affect the human body. The hippopotamus muttered dully. Rast was initially surprised, but in a moment he understood the right moment had come. He thanked the beast for the hint. Rast praised the hippopotamus, its concentration was simply perfect, but suddenly he heard Ari calling him, and the girl ran up quickly. Rast asked in surprise what had happened, and she, trembling with excitement, whispered that someone dangerous was looking for him. Ari whispered that she felt this person was not good, and warned him to be careful. Rast, eyes wide open, asked again what not good meant. Did she say his name? Ari, still out of breath after running, nodded. She whispered that his name was Lee Halsum, and a sinister smile played on his lips. Rast thought in shock. Lee Halsum really had come. He sincerely thanked Ari for her vigilance and asked her to tell everything in more detail on the way. His premonition grew more and more anxious with every step. He stretched out his hand to Ari. The girl looked surprised, but still gave hers. He firmly grasped it and said he would help. Rast quickly put Ari on the hippopotamus, that way they would get to the camp faster. He told her to hold on tight because the beast would rush like the wind, and Ari blushed but hugged him from behind so as not to fall. The hippopotamus rushed swiftly through the wastelands, and Ari pressed her cheek to Rast's back, feeling that despite the frantic speed, the movement was strangely smooth and quiet. She realized that the beast was deliberately moving more softly so they wouldn't be shaken. Rast explained to Ari that Halsum was his colleague in the Alchemists' Association, but he always brought only trouble and was perpetually dissatisfied. He added that Halsum was probably here because of the magical crystals. He had suspected this before, but did not expect everything to happen so quickly. Ari listened attentively, her face darkened, her gaze became anxious. She was silent, but it was clear that something was troubling her. Rast smiled and asked if something was bothering her. The girl answered in a trembling voice that she had seen unclearly, but the future showed that a battle lay ahead and it would be difficult. Ari added that she felt a real war was approaching. The visions appeared and disappeared, but this feeling could not be escaped, so they moved on. The girl pressed herself to Rast and said that the artifact he created worked flawlessly. Perhaps only because of it, she was now able to see the coming fight. Rast looked ahead and anxiously felt that Ari responded to his thoughts without letting him finish speaking, so there were no problems with the artifact, but the unease still did not leave him. He sternly asked Ari if she wanted to say that the fight between him and Lee Halsum was inevitable. Ari sadly replied that she was almost certain of it, and that scared her. Rast asked if that was all she saw, and Ari uncertainly admitted that she did not understand herself. She had never felt anything like this before, and she was truly afraid. The girl apologized. Rast smiled and said there was nothing to apologize for. On the contrary, he was grateful for her honesty. Suddenly Ari sharply raised her head and screamed. Rast looked at her in surprise, not understanding what was happening, and her gaze seemed to pass through him eerie. The girl whispered that the branching point was already near. It would come now, and the choice of Master Rast would decide everything. There are better and worse paths, but fate can go by any of them. Both are equally likely. Ari's eyes suddenly shone, although she did not notice it. Stunned by the vision, she whispered that fate was gathering from fragments, composing a code. The wind sings a song of wastelands, and she sees two people, and the shaman's hand. Rast noticed with surprise that magical elements flickered in Ari's eyes, and the monocle behaved strangely. His friend was truly incredible. Processing speed reached its limit, but the artifact connected with her eye. Rast thought that she was able to see the future, but how far? Ari sharply leaned back. The surge of the vision was too strong. She began to fall, but Rast managed to catch her. He looked at her fearfully, not understanding what had happened. Rast shouted for Ari to hold on, but she was unconscious and did not hear his scream. For several minutes the girl was delirious. Finally Ari came to her senses, wearily said his name and thanked him, calming him that she was fine and there was no need to worry. Rast froze in surprise. Her vision had stopped. He realized that the strain on the body from her eye was much stronger than he thought, and that was why she fainted. The boy reassured her. Everything was under control. Rast said confidently, "Whatever fate may be in the future, I will protect everyone." He awkwardly added that after all, they were family. Ari looked at him in surprise, then hugged him tightly and quietly whispered that he was right. Rast coughed embarrassedly and blushed. To change the subject, he said they needed to speed up and asked Ari to hold on tighter. After all, now they would go at full speed. Roa met them and shouted for them to hurry. Rast replied that everything was fine, helped Ari get down, and asked if she wanted to rest, but the girl firmly said she would go with him to support him. Ari added that she wanted to see everything with her own eyes. Rast smiled and agreed, and they set off together to the meeting place with Halsum. Roa warned Master Rast, "Be careful, there is evil hidden in this man." Rast thought with surprise that she saw this thanks to her insightful power. Incredible, yet he listened. Corin stood before Lahalsum in heavy armor made of meteoric iron. This armor was created not for protection, but to make her strikes more massive and destructive. The girl turned her head and smiled, saying that he had finally come. Rast smiled in response and apologized for making her wait. But suddenly his face changed, and a cold gaze fell on Halsam, who stood opposite. Lee Halsam's face blazed with anger, but anxiety hid in his eyes. Rast thought that this was truly him, a master by rank, and Korin would have a hard time dealing with him because her strength was in frontal attacks. Rast raised his hand right in front of Korin. The girl looked at him with surprise. He turned his back, covering her, and said he would handle it himself. She felt she could trust him with this. Lee Halsam tried to put something resembling a smile on his face and said he was glad to finally see Master Rast. He had long been heading to this meeting, and now it had come. Rast dryly asked what he owed his visit to and where this stench came from. Lee Halsam solemnly announced, "The Association of Alchemists officially resumes the activities of the Basic Research Department, and the president gave Rast a chance to work again in the prestigious Association of Alchemists." Halsam solemnly extended his hand and asked if Rasta was pleased with this news after all. It was a great honor for him, and said that now Rasta could go with him. Rasta looked at him stunned and replied that he would never in his life, under no circumstances, return back. Lahalsam opened his eyes wide and stared at him in shock. He simply could not believe what he heard. Rasta said that he left voluntarily. Yes, it all started with the disbanding of the Basic Research Department, but it was here that he truly managed to advance in his scientific pursuits. The boy added that if that was all, then he asked him to leave. Korin nodded approvingly, and the girls watched Lee Kalsam closely. Suddenly the man began to giggle. Rasta looked at him warily, and in a moment Lahalsam burst into hysterical laughter, throwing his head back. Korin, Roa, and Ari grabbed their weapons, ready to defend themselves if he suddenly attacked, while Kalsam only smiled wider. He croaked that there was no other way, none at all, so he would simply destroy them. Rasta looked at him in surprise as he rushed into the attack. Rasta loudly shouted about the start of activation, and protective scrolls rose around them along with the girls, while Ari, Roa, and Korin stepped back. The parchments instantly folded into shields, and Rasta angrily shouted at Lahalsam that master alchemists were forbidden to fight to the death. He recalled Ari's warning, but Kalsam suddenly changed. Rasta realized the matter was serious, and exploded with a scream that at best he would be stripped of his alchemist license. Does he not realize this? Rage overwhelmed Rasta. Suddenly Kalsam's hand turned into slime covered with poisonous mushrooms. He looked insane and shouted that he would leave no witnesses. Spores scattered around, instantly touching the ground and growing into new mushrooms. Russ covered his nose. A chill of horror ran through his body. These are spores. They are deadly dangerous. He stretched out his hand, restraining Ari and Roa, and warned. These are transmuted creatures of the slime mushroom type. Keep your distance and do not inhale. The mushrooms suddenly grew, and strange hands extended from their bodies. Roa gasped in surprise. The mushrooms grew limbs. Russ thought with disbelief that these were independent transmuted creatures weak alone, but there were too many of them, and moreover, they had the poisonous power of Halsam. He decided to destroy them with one blow. He stretched his hands forward. Scrolls appeared before him, blocking the mushroom's path. He apologized but firmly stated that he was forced to destroy them. A tiny whirlwind spun on his hand. Rust loudly spoke the command, "Grind." He was preparing to strike the creatures of Halsam. Roa asked in surprise, "Is this the same technique used for creating magical crystals?" Rust ordered the strike must be as powerful as possible and aimed at the grinding scroll. He looked fiercely at the enemies and let out a scream, releasing the restraints. His entire whirlwind of power rushed forward and struck the monsters. Mushrooms shattered into pieces, unable to withstand the force of the tornado, although they stubbornly reached for it. Russ thought that they needed to be ground into powder. You never know what these creatures are capable of. He held the tornado back, not letting them rise. Korin, Ari, and Roa froze and watched his struggle. They believed in Rust, but anxiety still gripped their hearts. The mushrooms scattered chaotically in different directions, colliding with each other. Some just stood and took the inevitable blow. Rust created a magical seal and touched it, directing the flow to carry the creatures away from the camp. Halsam, covered in slime, swayed under the gusts of wind. Ari, laughing through the tension, told Roa that the crushed mushrooms scattered all over the camp, as if by the force of the tornado, and Roa replied with a smile that it looked like a mushroom smoothie. Halsam watched as a mixture of sand, slime, and mushroom mush flew at him. His body slowly sank into the sticky mass, and soon his face completely disappeared under a thick layer of dirt. Russ noticed with interest that he had ground all the mushrooms. He stopped the tornado and scanned the battlefield to see the result with his own eyes. The boy screamed in shock when he realized what had emerged after his attack. A strange mass completely covered Lee Halsam, and only one of his eyes and a few fingers peeked out from beneath it. Korin leaned on her sword and, smiling, said that Rust was merciless as always. One of the sisters exclaimed that everything happened too fast, and another added that his power was simply incredible. Rust heard the admiring shouts and looked proud, but as he rolled up the scroll, he awkwardly thought that he would rather sink through the ground from such attention. Lahalsam began to cough, choke on sand, and struggle to get out. Slowly digging himself out of the mud, he looked like a sand ghost, and as soon as he freed his mouth, he shouted in rage. He hysterically screamed that all his mushrooms were destroyed, and how dare Rast do such a thing. Now he looked so miserable that it was hard to believe he was an alchemist. Rast felt disgusted looking at his former colleague. Corin only furrowed her brows, not understanding at all what was happening. The sisters, though hiding their faces under masks, watched attentively. Lahalsam shook slime off his hand and summoned a scroll with 2 seals, around which black smoke curled, clearly revealing sinister intentions. Rast, with his heart in his throat, recognized that it was a declaration scroll. The man touched the seal and instantly a giant mushroom grew, spewing thick smoke, covering the entire battlefield. Rast pondered, was this a smoke screen? No, a gas, heavier than air, spread low, creeping along the ground. So what kind of action was this? Rast looked where Halsam was supposed to stand. From the dispersing smoke, he saw him fleeing and muttered in surprise that this scoundrel just ran away. Corin asked confusedly why he had come at all then. Roa shouted loudly that they must immediately chase after him. But Rast sharply stopped her. This was clearly some kind of poison. He unrolled the scroll again and commanded, "Activate, remove all restrictions." Despite everything, Lahalsam remained a master-level alchemist, capable of something truly terrible. Rast touched the seal and loudly pronounced the cleansing command. Magical signs like a dome covered the mushroom and its suffocating smoke. Ari said with a tremor that the space seemed distorted. Rast calmly explained that it was supposed to be, so this is a barrier for separating gases, and warned not to approach. He stared intently at the mushroom and understood that it required colossal concentration. At first, he separated the gases and gave each a spherical shape, one of the bubbles filled with pure oxygen. Rast loudly shouted the projection command and instantly thought that solar heat should be used. Above the mushroom appeared glass that collected and amplified the sun's rays, and at a high oxygen concentration, thermal ignition occurred, exactly what he was waiting for. Roa smelled a strange odor and accidentally inhaled. Rast instantly grabbed a jar and began sucking all the purple gas into it, neutralizing the poison. Rolling up the scroll, he shouted loudly, "It's all over." Roa said that now they needed to catch up with Lee Halsam. He was ahead. Rast shouted to Corin that he was following because Roa could see far. But suddenly Ari screamed in horror for him to look back. Black dots appeared in the sky and were rushing closer. Rast raised his head and froze in amazement. Roa focused the power of her eye and carefully examined what these creatures were. Monsters emerged before them, giant fish that could fly. The girl shouted that these were armored salmons with wings that had evolved, and Rast froze in amazement. Why now? Rast stared ahead and anxiety choked him, to rush after Lee Halsam or stay and help others defend the camp. Karin shouted loudly, "Ahead, heavenly salmons," and ordered Ari and Roa to go forward, hold back the enemy and assess its strength, while she would take command of the soldiers and evacuate the civilians. The girl added, "The main thing now is to survive. Everything else is secondary." Closing her eyes for a few seconds, she immersed herself in thought and planned what to do. Corin called out to Rast to follow Lahalsam, but added that she would accept any of his decisions. The boy looked at her with surprise. He was stunned by such a commanding right of choice. He sighed heavily and felt instincts whispering to him to pursue Halsam. Rast realized this was the very moment Ari had warned about, a fateful crossroads where he must choose, to chase or to stay. He closed his eyes and thought that Corin and the others were not very skilled against the heavenly creatures. The salmons were already flying closer and closer, and his fist clenched. He saw it clearly. A horde of enemies in hard scales was pouring from the sky, and without alchemy and artifacts, the fight would turn into an exhausting defense. Casualties would be inevitable. Rast stood at a crossroads. To allow the camp to perish or let Lahalsam escape, the choice suffocated him, but there was a reason why master alchemists were forbidden to fight at full strength. If they unleashed their full potential, the battle would become a real catastrophe. The prohibition was not to protect the alchemists, but to protect those around them from their destructive power. He reasoned, if they seriously went on the attack, the threat to everyone around would multiply. Karin knew this. As a feudal, she had to care first about the safety of the people, but still left the final choice to him. Rast replied that he understood. He pressed his hand to his chest and solemnly said that he would stay to defend the camp. Karin looked him in the eyes attentively. Rast felt that she was ready to take on the burden of guilt. If people died because of her decision, she was the leader of this land and had to hide her pain within herself. He smiled and told Karin that they would deal with Lahalsam later. He would definitely return. Karin was surprised, then smiled in response. She said that was right and ordered him to prepare to destroy the sky salmons. Rast loudly replied that he understood everything. He smiled and a thought flashed through his mind. He must manage so as not to disgrace her trust. Suddenly Ari shouted for him not to do it. She, holding her eye, begged to pursue Lahalsam, her voice sobbing with anxiety. Rast looked at her in surprise, but Karin sternly ordered Ari to be silent. Only she gives orders on the battlefield. Now Ari had to fulfill her duty. The girl bowed her head. She agreed to the lady's order and quietly said she would go ahead. Rast watched her go with regret. He thought he sincerely believed in her visions. Once, at his previous job, he lived passively and did not even notice it himself. He could spend days just staring at the ceiling. Now he was given a chance to choose the future himself. Trust and hope blossomed in his heart. He watched her for a few more seconds, then rushed toward the battlefield. There was only one thing on his mind. He wanted to protect what no one could replace. What Karin, the girls, and the camp residents gave him, he would never forget. Heavenly salmons were already flying over the camp, and Rast froze. They split. One part goes to the camp, the other towards the capital. He decided that this might even be for the better, but one question did not leave him. Why do they need to fly to the capital? Rast saw how Ari and Roa were stabbing spears into one of the salmons. He rushed to them and shouted that he was already nearby. The girls confidently replied that he should not do this. They also know how to fight and will definitely manage. Rast looked at them in surprise, but soon smiled proudly and loudly asked only one thing: where are all the others? The girls replied that the people were hidden in the food storages, and Rast thought that was wise. The enemy attacks from the sky, so underground cellars are the best protection. He praised them and said he counted on their strength. Rast sharply turned around and rushed to the tent. Only one thought was beating in his head: they have no right to waste time. Running into the room, he hurriedly grabbed bottles with elixirs, unrolled scrolls, poured the contents on them, and loudly ordered to start a quick transmutation. The potions seemed to come alive and turned into magical signs that were engraved on the paper. He repeated the movements again and again with each bottle, afraid to miss something. He called out to remove the gravitational restriction. His goal was to compress the solution of magical elements and create 9 spheres. Alongside the symbols, balls began to appear in which a shimmering liquid splashed. These were the best materials, and Rast decided not to spare them at such a moment. He looked at the scroll and, with bitter irony, recalled his own rule: always save and use everything to the last drop. Now he was burning priceless resources, but firmly said that he would do it again later. Rast thought, if this saves the camp, the sacrifice will be justified. His vision began to blur. He felt how the rapid transmutation exhausted him. It required incredible precision, like piercing fabric with a needle, and at the same time he had to keep dozens of things under control. Rast clenched his hand, forced himself to hold on, hoarsely whispered that there was still a little left, just a bit, and he knew losing concentration would mean the end. On the second attempt, there were simply no materials. His eyes were sticking shut. His body did not obey. Horror gripped his heart. Consciousness was slipping away from him, and he felt that this could turn into a disaster. Before him appeared the faces of Korin, Roa, Ari, and all the villagers. This awakened him, and the boy sharply opened his eyes. He shouted, clenching his fingers to hold the potion spheres. He could not allow everything to be lost. Sighing with relief, he felt almost ready. Only a moment separated him from unconsciousness, and the scrolls shone with white light. He forged scrolls to fight celestial beings. Each such artifact usually consumed mountains of materials and a lot of time. But now he was creating 9 at once. It seemed almost impossible. 9 scrolls rose into the air and smoothly descended right into his hands. Finally, everything was ready. His gaze stopped on the bracelet given by Roa. Her words echoed again in his head: if necessary, you can cut it off. The boy squeezed the amulet and quietly whispered, "Thank you." Rast burst out of the tent, clutching the amulet in his hand, and rushed to help his friends, praying that no one else would be hurt. In the middle of the square, a battle raged. Celestial salmons circled in the sky and attacked in flocks. They rushed at Karin, but she just stood and smiled. Her face was hidden behind a helmet. Rast noticed her bloody smile. She, like lightning, cut through the monsters, and pieces of their bodies, sliced by Karin's sword, fell to the ground. He whispered with admiration, "This is incredible," and suddenly realized it was her black armor that gave her that loud nickname. He exclaimed that before him stood a true heroine of war. She charged forward like a mad black bull, mercilessly crushing enemies. Rast marveled at her fury. He watched the fight and clearly knew she was tens of times stronger than ordinary people, but she lacked the weight to become even more powerful. That was why her heavy armor and huge sword compensated for that weakness. They became part of her strength. Karin landed next to Rast, leaving a deep dent in the ground. The boy looked at her power in amazement. She smiled and asked if he was ready, and Rast confidently replied, "Yes." Celestial salmons circled overhead like predators in the air, searching for victims. Karin joyfully exclaimed, "He is fast, as always, and this is just a warm-up." Rast smiled and joked that it seemed she could manage without him. She seriously said that he shouldn't be so confident and ordered him to look more carefully at the slain monsters. Rast lowered his gaze and froze. Their bodies lay before him. Karin simply explained, if you just cut the celestial salmons, their roe would scatter all over the area. That is why now everyone counts on him. He must help deal with this. Rust smiled widely and replied that he understood everything. He would sweep them away with one strike. The boy touched the scrolls, making sure they were under his control. He tossed the scrolls into the air and shouted that the time had come. He repeated the activation command 9 times to awaken them all. In the camp, Ari and Roa noticed bright flashes. Ari exclaimed in surprise it was the alchemy of Master Rust, and Karin ran up and ordered them to rest a bit. Rust patiently waited for the pack to approach. If the goal was simply to tear the enemies to pieces, he would have used shredding, but in the camp that would have turned into a disaster. The boy acted differently. Scrolls of the opposite purpose. He loudly commanded them to manifest. Before the celestial salmons suddenly appeared a wall shield, from which hundreds of arrows blossomed. The monsters loudly crashed into the magical barrier. Rosa entwined the entire pack with her vines, and the creatures howled in pain. Suddenly, the magic began to fade. Nothing remained in place of the fish, as if the celestial salmons had never existed. Ari sighed, full of wonder, and Roa beamed with joy. Karin said the main thing was the threat was gone. Rosa's vines slowly melted away. Rust pondered manifestation scrolls could be used quite differently. He rearranged parts of the rows and materialized them again, then, smiling, thanked Rosa. But he knew the salmons had not disappeared. They were much larger than those he had seen before. Their fins had turned into wings, and their scales consisted of magical elements. Perhaps it is precisely thanks to magic that they fly. This thought captivated him. The rose vine touched his face. Rast apologized and added that after the battle, he would perform the autopsy himself to find out the truth. He knew that Rosi would have to work hard, but so be it. Other flocks hovered over the camp, as if heading further. Rast smiled time to exterminate them all before they cause harm. He shouted at the scrolls to scatter. The wind caught them and they dispersed in different directions, and Rast watched this with confidence. The end of the battle was near. Meanwhile, Lint, who usually stored food and sometimes acted as a cook, desperately held the defense in the storerooms. He, along with several warriors, fought with a giant axe. This started immediately after the attack on the warehouses, and there was no end in sight to the onslaught. One of the fighters shouted that he would go forward and distract the enemies. Lint angrily cut in that the circle must not be broken, and besides, he was no longer the commander. No matter what was said, he fought with a smile. When one of the salmons approached, he met it with a shout and cleaved it with his axe. Lint spat, "These creatures are incredibly resilient," repeatedly renewing their attacks. The warrior asked what to do next. After all, they would not hold out like this. They fought, continuously striking. Lint rubbed his cheek, lost in thought. The situation looked hopeless, but a solution had to be found immediately. He reminded his comrade. Corin ordered only to hold on. The warrior asked indignantly, how much longer? Strength was at its limit. Lint replied, trust her, otherwise no way. He believed she never abandoned them and would not abandon them. Now the thought of disobeying her order never even occurred to him. Lint raised the axe above his head and shouted to the people, hold on. Everyone responded with a powerful shout. The heavenly salmons descended again. Lint smiled ominously. He lifted their spirits, but the battle was tough. It was necessary to think about retreat as well, but he relied on Corin. Suddenly, a warrior shouted for the commander to look up. Lint angrily said that he was not the commander and raised his eyes. In the sky, flocks of salmons were entangled in vines and disappeared with a piercing cry, and the warriors asked if this was a new monster. Lint, frozen with admiration, exclaimed, no, someone is devouring the heavenly salmons. Suddenly, someone shouted to attract the commander's attention. The monsters broke through. Lint sharply turned around and a whole flock burst out before him, rushing at the people. The warriors threw mines, trying to hold back the heavenly salmons, but in vain. He stood before the people and shouted, the enemy is coming, keep order. The boy clenched the axe and prepared to strike. A monster emerged right before him, and Lint turned pale. Could it be that he would die like this? It was hard for him to believe that death would come from a heavenly salmon. But suddenly the rest of the flock was entwined with thorny vines. The fish screamed in pain, trying to break free, but in vain. Lint froze, stunned by the terrible sight. He could not believe his eyes. Vines grew before him from scrolls, so this was definitely the work of Master Rast. Lint stood, watching as the predators were torn to pieces, and gloomily said that even his axe wouldn't do it. So quickly it was terrifying. People approached him. One shouted that they barely held on. Another added, master alchemists are truly frightening. Lint came to his senses and muttered, strange, such a carefree guy, yet he has such terrible moves in reserve. He ordered the warrior to report the losses. He replied, No fatalities, only about a dozen wounded, mostly scratches and bruises. Lint smiled with relief and said that it couldn't be better wished for. One of the warriors, hesitating, said he wanted to say something to the commander. Lint sighed. How many times must he repeat that he is no longer the commander? The man replied sadly that they were of little use. Lint looked at him in surprise, then sharply turned away. He called him a fool. He asked who would evacuate the civilians if not them. How many people would have died if the monsters had broken through immediately? He emphasized their role in this battle is extremely important. Lint raised his eyes to the sky and whispered that life is realizing one's own weakness before great power, and the warrior looked at him in amazement. He cheerfully slapped the soldier on the shoulder and added that he shouldn't worry. It's worth rejoicing that Master Rast is on their side. Everyone has their place and their task. Lint said that if any of them were not there, everything would have ended much worse. Suddenly a shout rang out, "Their mules are under attack," and Lint asked in surprise what had happened. He loudly called several volunteers to come. They need to finish what was started and hold the defense ahead. The warrior smiled and said that for them he would always remain the commander. The sun was breaking through the sky, now free from monsters. Meanwhile, Lee Giles was wading through the forest. Liquid was dripping from him, the one that covered him in the fight with Rast, clothes torn, body exhausted. He could barely move his legs, almost losing consciousness, and in despair asked himself why everything had happened this way. The scoundrel who appeared in the association and turned everything upside down is to blame for everything. Lee felt Rast's brazen gaze on him. He remembered how Rast came and declared that he had loved alchemy since childhood and wanted to study magical elements, and that ignited rage in him. Nonsense, who can love alchemy? Childhood came alive before my eyes. Little Lee beamed with joy upon seeing a mushroom grow near a flower, and excitedly called his mother to show this wonder of nature. Mother screamed that it was filth and ordered to get rid of it immediately. Before it spread, her screams still cut his heart. The boy wanted to object but got scared. The mother asked what he was doing today, and he only silently bowed his head. His parents, famous alchemists, had extraordinary hopes for him. They wanted him to become the youngest master. Eventually, he headed the Department of Military Alchemy, and Rast appeared. Everyone called him a genius, the youngest master, a miracle of alchemy, but Lee hated these words, considering them meaningless. He whispered, full of hatred, that disgusting Rast will pay. He will never forgive him, and not only him, he will take revenge on everyone. Lee swore that Rast would not know peace. He humiliated him, saw in him only a upstart who had accidentally stumbled upon talent, and with a gloomy look moved further through the forest. He looked at his leg in horror and exclaimed, "What is this?" Lackhilsum pulled out a potion and shouted that this was nonsense. Why was he the one so lucky to end up here? He got angry. Why wasn't his potion working? Maybe he needed more. Without hesitation, he began pouring one after another directly onto the wound, deciding to pour it all out, but there was no result. It was strange and hopeless, but suddenly he had an idea. The association must have better quality potions. The main thing was to get there. He sharply lifted his torn cloak and pulled a scroll from his stash. Lee Kawsum grumbled that he hated using this thing. Clothes always got dirty, but it was too late. He had to act. He unrolled the scroll and began reciting the spell, and the spatial connection silently merged with his body. Parasitic, transmuted beast number 4, king of Mixamycetes. A strange white creature seeped out of the scroll and completely enveloped Lackhilsum. He commanded the creature, "Carry me to the capital." The white parasite moved across the ground as if on hundreds of thin leg threads. It would carry its master to the goal. Eventually, Lee Kawsum reached the capital. Right in front of the castle, he ordered the creature to stop and, uttering the command "return," sent it back into the scroll. He rushed to the open gates with only one thought in his head, to quickly get the needed potion. Usually, the guards would have detained him. He looked too suspicious. But, seeing a crowd of civilians and guards, he began babbling that fish were falling from the sky and their weapons were useless. A guard asked where the army was and called for immediate reinforcements. Suddenly, a dark substance burst from Lackhilsum's wound, causing him to writhe in pain. He thought that the Alchemists' Association was literally around the corner, and they would save him there. He turned the corner and suddenly saw the ruins of a building, around which people were bustling among the debris, and Lee Kawsum could not believe his eyes. Could this really not be the place? But no, this was exactly the building of the Association. He fell to the ground because he finally realized this pile of stones and dirt was exactly what he had devoted his whole life to. It can't be. It couldn't have perished so easily. Suddenly, a voice came from behind. Isn't that Master Lee Kawsum himself? Well, well. Suddenly, he understood. He was inside a barrier, and no one else could see their silhouettes through it. An unknown man with a predatory smile pointed to his wound and said he saw something interesting there. He shifted his gaze to the ruins and added that was indeed the Alchemists' Association, and at that moment, a flock of celestial salmons descended from the sky. They were flying straight toward the ruins, as if something there was calling them. The unknown man added that the attack was probably accidental, but impressive. If not for that irritable swordswoman, no other building would have survived, and he regretted that everything had happened just like that. Lahilsam crawled backward, shouting in fear, "Who is he? What does he want?" The unknown man just smiled and laughed. "What nonsense is this? Pathetic and uninteresting, just a human." He added that Chaosum should be thanked, but he recoiled and asked distrustfully, "For what?" The unknown man replied, it was precisely these defective magical schemes that completely ruined his plan. In a moment, he appeared before Lahilsam and grabbed him by the face. He lifted him up and began pouring dark matter into the body. "Well then, let's see." Suddenly he felt something tasty and immediately decided that he liked this prey. The demon inside Lee Kasum grew insanely fast. His affinity with mushrooms was impressive, and negative emotions only fueled it the perfect soil. The unknown man said he wanted to give him a gift, a sign of gratitude. And suddenly Lahilsam's body began to emit streams of dark matter, dark currents burst from his wound. The unknown man whispered that Lee Kasum awaited a new life, he would be reborn, and it was wonderful. He was even glad he stayed here. "Time to disappear, who knows when that woman will appear. Good luck to you, Lahilsam, in your new demonic life," he said in farewell. Lahilsam opened his eyes and felt the pain in his legs suddenly disappear. People rushed to him, asking if he was okay. Lee Kasum silently opened his eyes. But suddenly, magical mushrooms began to sprout from his body. The crowd screamed in horror. Someone shouted that mushrooms were growing out of him. Women gasped. Children cried. His gaze twisted, his face became demonic, and people turned away in disgust. He looked around confusedly, and the people around shouted, "This is no longer a man, but a demon. He is the one who summoned the heavenly salmons from the sky." Passers-by panicked and scattered, shouting for someone to kill the demon Lahilsam. "He must be destroyed immediately. Call the army knights. Where are the alchemists?" They shouted, but only students and the wounded survived. The demonic Chaosum looked around in horror. He did not understand why everyone looked at him with such fear, and cold sweat drenched his forehead. The crowd shouted that poison was coming from him. "Run away quickly, and do not touch under any circumstances." The demonic Chaosum stretched out his hand and croaked, "Wait." But suddenly a bullet struck him. He froze, raised his head, and saw a man with a weapon in front of him. A squad of knights lined up before him, their rifles aimed directly at him. The chief commander shouted that fire could only be opened on his command. "Keep weapons ready." The captain raised his hand and grimly ordered the warriors to load the magical weapons. At his signal, a fiery volley of bullets burst forth, piercing Lahilsam's body. The commander shouted to cease fire. "This is a real demon. Ordinary weapons do not affect him. Neither bullets nor elements, nothing works." He raised his hand and loudly declared that there were too few warriors. One of the knights shouted that they should go for a frontal attack. Captain Harold replied that it was more complicated. According to the report, the demon emits poisonous vapors. He gave the order to change the magical elements and open fire with a single volley. The knights shouted that they understood. Suddenly, a barrage of shots thundered, and Lee Chaosum tried to say something, but only indistinct murmurs came from him. Suddenly, he saw his reflection in the window, and it was not a man, but a demon. Lahilsam froze in horror, not believing his own eyes. Captain Harold shouted, "Open new fire." Lee Chaosum growled and roared that he was burning hot. Captain realized, the fire has no effect. The demon is invulnerable to fire magic. He ordered to stop shooting, draw swords, and attack in hand-to-hand combat. The knights rushed forward, but Chaosum sharply lowered his eyes. He noticed a hatch under his feet and, like a shadow, dissolved into the liquid and disappeared into the sewer. Captain Harold, in shock, shouted, "The demon fled into the dungeon." The captain shouted that Lee Chaosum escaped into the sewer, broke through tunnels, and slipped away from the knights, moving as far away as possible. Meanwhile, Karin stepped forward and announced that after the attack of the heavenly salmons they suffered losses, but the sale of magical stones will bring them some profit, and she wants to honor those who truly distinguished themselves in this battle. Her gaze stopped on her friends, and she called Ari and Roa. She said that they not only instantly assessed the enemy's strength, but also immediately passed this information to others, so the disaster was avoided. The girls silently nodded. Then Corin addressed Linta and warmly praised him for his courage in battle. It was thanks to him that the civilians were unharmed. He restrained the reckless ones who wanted to rashly rush at the enemy. He awkwardly replied that such words were pleasant to him. Although he had resigned, he was glad he could help. Corin turned her gaze to Rast. The main hero placed his fist on his chest and solemnly said, "I am listening." She exclaimed that he had swiftly prepared an attack that destroyed the heavenly salmons, and his actions deserved the highest praise. It was thanks to him that they were almost unharmed. One wrong step could have turned into a tragedy. Karin admitted that she found it hard to find words to truly thank Rast. She added that she was sincerely glad about his arrival to their ranks. Rast sincerely thanked for such warm words. Everyone loudly applauded the hero who saved them, and the camp was filled with joy. The main hero looked at his friends with a happy smile. Everyone nearby sincerely smiled at him. Rast felt as if his heart finally eased. He had already forgotten about Lahalesum's escape, and all worries receded. Corin smiled and said that she had already sent an official report to the Association of Alchemists, in which she detailed Lahalesum's attack. She reminded that everyone had seen how the salmons attacked the capital. Obviously, the association itself was going through hard times now. Rast thought he would not return, but his chest ached for his former home. Corin added that confusion and bewilderment now reigned in the capital, so waiting for orders was not an option. Rast said with a smile that on the contrary, they should seize the moment and start selling their magical crystals.